My name is Ethan Cole. I'm 31 years old. The night everything changed was June 14th, 2019. If you're hearing this like you're sitting by a campfire with me, that's exactly the picture I want you to hold. Orange light licking at the trunks of gnarly junipers, the smell of sage and the distant iron of the desert, and a sky so violently clear you could read the cracks in each star. That's how the trip began, ordinary, even beautiful. It was supposed to be a quick getaway from the city. 3 friends, 1 battered Toyota, a beat-up dome tent, and a weekend to trade fluorescent office lights for moonlight. We picked a place on an online forum, a stretch of Bureau of Land Management land west of Phoenix that someone called Dry Creek Basin. The photos, reddish rock outcrops, a narrow wash, a scattering of piñon pines, looked remote but reachable. The map showed a feeder road that petered out near a place marked Coyote Hollow. That name had a ring to it, something cinematic, and Marcus, funny, loud, the kind of friend who thought every dinner was a potential story, said, "Perfect. No one will bother us out there." There were 4 of us by the time we left. Me, Marcus Hale, my cousin Jake Whitman, and Nora Voss. Jake was practical, the kind who read the owner's manual before he drove anything. Nora was quiet until you listened. When she did speak, it was precise, almost like she measured the weight of each word. Marcus lived for the moment and was the one who'd organized the whole thing the week before, waving a map like a treasure chart and grinning as if the desert were a secret waiting to be opened. We drove out Friday evening, the sun melting into the horizon. The farther we went, the fewer cars we passed. The GPS lost signal at some washed-out turn, and we took a spur that the map labeled, helpfully vague, as 4 Wadid recommended. The Toyota coughed and climbed, suspension complaining, but it made the drop-off before the basin. We picked a wide, flat area near a scrub-lined wash, lined up the tent under a lone juniper, and set up for the night. For a while, we were the kind of friends who could speak in jokes and not mean it. Marcus had a small fire going, Jake unpacked cans of beans, and Nora and I laid out the sleeping pads like we were preparing for a measly camping advert. Before the night was over, we named the place for ourselves, Juniper Ledge. That was partly because we like naming things, and partly because places with names feel less empty. The weather was patient and warm. The sky bled stars. We drank a few beers and talked through the usual list: jobs, exes, who still owed who money. The desert at night makes people confess things they haven't told light. Maybe that's because darkness disguises the outline of your face. It softens judgment. There were other things small and forgettable at the time that I want to make clear because memory plays tricks in the aftermath. A ranger's bulletin in the town before we left had warned about flash floods and narrow washes, which we all shrugged off as seasonal prudence. A local at the gas station told us, over his cracked cigarette, to watch the ground out there, and then laughed like he'd said something obvious. Marcus found a rusted tin can and insisted on keeping it as though it were a talisman. At one point, Nora whispered she had heard a roadrunner yesterday, and Jake scoffed. Too early? And Nora smiled like she didn't mean the bird. We went to sleep thinking we'd wake to a normal morning. Sun, coffee, maybe a short hike along the wash, and then drive back to the city before Monday. That's what the plan was, simple and harmless. Even the fact that the map's feeder road ended in a series of cairns and an arrow scratched into a stone felt like an adventure detail rather than a warning. The first hint of something off was daylight itself. I remember waking before dawn, the air already edged with heat, my mouth dry from the kind of thirst that makes your throat go hollow. I unzipped the tent and looked out. Marcus was already up, pacing back toward the wash with his hands in his pockets. "We should check the trail," he said, as if he were stating an errand. I grabbed my boots without thinking. We walked into the wash together, bare gravel crunching beneath our boots. The basin was exquisitely silent but for the small mechanical sounds of our movement, the rattle of a zipper, the squeak of a pack strap. The wash curved like a pale snake. The earth was marked with tracks, coyote prints, rabbit hops, the faint smudge of some larger animal's pads. We followed the wash upstream out of habit. The geography of canyons invites it. We thought we'd scramble up a ridge and take pictures, maybe find a slot canyon. I remember taking a photo of Nora balancing on a rock, the wide sky behind her. She never smiled for pictures, but That one, she let out a small, satisfied breath, like a secret she'd been keeping. Upstream, the wash narrowed. The sun climbed, and the shadows thinned to ribbons. We passed a rock that had been painted with initials. Someone had left a stub of rope tied to a low juniper. We joked that maybe a hiker had been there before us, someone who'd left a mark to say, "I was here." The joke hangs now like a small, cruel thing. By the time the sun was high, too high for comfort, we were a good mile from our campsite. The path we were on was little more than a suggestion. Sometimes footprints, sometimes not. And at intervals, the wash climbed into a shelf of rock that required a careful scramble. Jake spotted something that made him pause and bend down. A shallow depression in the dust, like the outline of a boot print, but wrong. It was wider across the toe than a boot should have been, and the pattern of tread was not machine-made. It looked almost like a crescent with grooves that diverged and rejoined like the spokes of a wheel. None of us could say why it bothered us so much. Maybe because it was big. Maybe because there was another one, then another, tracking the wash like a line of punctuation. We didn't talk about it. We simply kept walking, each of us aware of the print's presence, like a new scent on our clothes. We were about 700 words into this telling before the story proper begins, the moment when ordinary detail unspools into the uncanny. Up to now, it's been the setup, the characters, the landscape, the ordinary choices that led us to that wash and to the boot-shaped depressions. Now, at the thin edge where calm becomes fracture, I will tell you what happened next, the part where the desert shows you the price of curiosity. But take a breath first. If you want to stand where I stood, if you want to hear each shift in my voice like a twig snapping underfoot, listen close. It started with a sound. At first I thought it was wind, the kind that moves through the creosote and makes the little metal bottles on our packs sing. But this had rhythm. A slow tapping, like someone knocking a hollow. We stopped. Marcus looked up, squinting where the wash closed in. He frowned and then called my name, quick and low. We all heard it then. Not the random scatter of bird calls, nor the steady wind, but a pattern like footsteps on a different surface, the kind that never came closer but never quite left. I remember the hairs on my arms standing as if they had their own memory. "Probably some rock fall," Jake said. His voice betrayed the exact thing he was trying not to believe. We went forward anyway, because what else do you do when you're already walking into the darkening throat of a canyon? We went forward, and the prince went with us. The tapping kept time, patient and deliberate, and for the first time I saw how many of those crescent tracks there were. Scores of them, leading away and then curving deeper into a narrow cleft where the light vanished. We followed them like idiots, because curiosity in the Arizona heat is sticky, and because for people like us, a canyon is a story waiting to be read. We crossed the threshold and the world changed temperature. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. We crossed the threshold and the world changed temperature. The thin desert heat folded into something colder. The kind of cold that doesn't come from air but from absence. Absence of sky, absence of horizon, the sense that the world has been narrowed to the size of your breath. The wash squeezed us sideways and up into a fissure, rocks pressing their elbows into our packs. Light refused to travel far in there. It hit walls and died. Every sound we made bounced back with a lag, like someone answering a question slowly, and the tapping we had heard turned into a rhythm that set our pulses out of sync. Marcus kept moving, as if momentum could outrun a feeling. He still grinned sometimes, like a man who'd bet wrong but enjoyed the wager. That time he was laughing under his breath, louder than necessary. Nora walked close to the wall, fingertips grazing the rough stone as if checking the texture. Jake, practical Jake, carried the GPS even though the screen blinked, no signal. He held it out like a cross. "This is ridiculous," he said, but his voice was thin. It was in that narrow throat that we first smelled it. Not rot, not smoke, but copper and something wet, like the first breath of a storm that never arrives. The scent pooled in the cracks and made my chest tight. I told myself it was nothing. The mind makes sense of bad things by naming them ordinary things, but the proof was in the tracks. Where the crescent prints had been shallow in loose gravel, here they became deeper, like the press of a heavy foot. And between those larger impressions there were smaller marks, like the percussion of claws or toes, arranged in patterns that made no sense. We stopped at a bend where the walls curled together. Marcus put his hand against the stone and breathed out, "Looks like someone's been cutting through here." It was a casual lie. He wanted there to be another human story to latch onto, someone else who'd been stupid enough to leave a trail. But the cuts on the rock were fresh. Someone had scraped at the stone with a metal edge recently. There were flakes of rust caught in the grooves, and when I bent to look, I saw the tin can Marcus had joked about earlier. Ours, the talisman, tucked under a slab like it had been put there on purpose. "That's," Nora began, and then she stopped because there was nothing to finish with. She held her breath like a child waiting for thunder. Jake picked up the can with gloved fingers. He turned it over. Inside was not the empty, dented metal we had put there the night before, but a fragment of cloth and a smear of something dark smeared into the tin like an afterimage. It had the fugitive smell of iron. He set it down very carefully and said, "Okay, that's not ours." By then, the tapping had changed. It had gone from intermittent to a slow, deliberate knocking, timed like someone counting. It wasn't always the same pitch, sometimes a dull thump, sometimes a metallic ring, but it was close and it was coming from somewhere ahead. Marcus, who had been making decisions all evening like he was flipping through tarot cards, said, "We should turn around. Now." Turning around is easier said than done when a canyon rearranges itself. The path back had been swallowed by shadow and a ledge of rock that hadn't been there 15 minutes before. For the first time, the canyon felt like an animal that could close its mouth. We attempted to climb out, and the handholds slid with a fine dust that coated our palms. Jake cursed and scrambled. Nora took my hand to steady herself, and the skin of her fingers was suddenly ice. Marcus swore, and then he was quiet, listening. "Listen," he said. We all did. In the hush, there was a voice, or perhaps an imitation of one, a muffled calling. It sounded far off, as if someone had a mouthful of pebbles and was pushing syllables through them. Ethan, my own name, came back to me in that voice, but not in the voice of a friend. It was a hollow echo of my name, like a bad recording. "That's not me," I said, because it wasn't. I didn't call. My mouth had become a dry cave, but the canyon answered my denial with something else. An indistinct series of sounds that might have been laughter or might have been the shifting of rock. Marcus mouthed my name again, and suddenly the three of them were looking at me like I was the only solid thing left. "Split up," Marcus said, as if splitting the group was a rational tactic. "We go around the bend. Keep eyes on each other. 2 minutes, then call." 2 minutes is nothing and everything in a place that trades time like currency. We moved in the small, clumsy order of people who half believe safety can be manufactured by procedure. I took the lead on the left side where the light slanted, Nora stayed by the middle slab, Jake hugged the wall on the right, and Marcus, bless him, went ahead to check the next squeeze. We were careful to speak in small words, suffused with the false bravado of men who think danger will be polite if they name it first. It didn't help. 10 minutes later, I turned to call the check-in word and found Nora where she'd been, but not Jake. He'd been swallowed by a curve in the rock without so much as a flinch. For a breathless moment, I thought he was behind me, messily playing a trick. Then I heard the dragging, a sound like cloth across stone, but with a rhythm that matched the earlier tapping. A little pebble dislodged and bounced down into a pool of shadow. "Jake?" I shouted. My voice broke on the second syllable, and the canyon took it and folded it into the dark. Marcus's footsteps hurried away at the bend. He called Jake's name. There was no answer, only that slow tapping again, which now sounded like something rapping from within the very belly of the earth. I ran. Not heroically, more like a man trying to outrun a truth he did not want to accept. I went down a narrow chute, slid on dust, cranked my shoulder into a fissure, and heaved myself around a slab, and there, just beyond a shadow, was a strip of torn fabric snagged on a protruding stone. It was a piece of Jake's shirt. The cheap cotton he wore, faded at the collar. It hung like a ragged flag. Below it, in the dust, there were prints. Ours, certainly, and then others. They were larger now, and between them were tiny heel marks that seemed to drag like someone had tried to walk and had been pulled. There were also small symbols traced into the dust in a looping hand. circles crossed by lines like the templates of a starfish made by a child. I knelt to touch one, and the dust smeared under my fingertip like ash. The moment my skin made contact, the tapping stilled. There was a sound behind me, a whispering close behind my ear that didn't come from breath, but from the rock itself. "Ethan," it said. Not my name spoken normally. This was the canyon's version of me, a flat mimic. My scalp went tight. I turned, and there was nothing but the slide of light and a smear of darker stone where something had rubbed. Then Marcus was there, breathing hard, eyes blown wide. He was holding something in both hands, something that glinted with a soft, internal light. He thrust it toward me without meaning to, a shard of mirror, sharp along one edge and fogged with the dust of something old. Reflected in that glass was not my face, but a smear of shadow, like a photograph corrupted mid-develop. His lip trembled. "I heard him," he said, and his voice had the thinness of a man who'd learned to lie to himself. "I heard Jake calling, and then," he swallowed. "Then nothing. I found this." We stood there in the narrow throat, 3 breathing bodies, and the canyon holding its hands over our heads, the tap-tap of something counting in a rhythm that had become our heartbeat. Somewhere further on, the wash narrowed to a dark that looked like a closed eye. Beyond that, the tracks continued, heading into a place where sunlight could not go. I picked up the tin can again because ritual is stubborn. The smear inside had dried into a pattern that now looked almost deliberate, like someone had pressed a thumb into liquid and dragged it. The thing that had felt like a small storm now sat in my palm as something crude and intimate. "Call it in," Nora said, her voice so small it sounded like a coin dropped into a deep well. "Call it in to the ranger." My phone still had no signal. Jake's phone, when we found it a few paces ahead, face down, was cracked and blank. Marcus fumbled for something to lash onto the wall, and then suddenly there was a sound from ahead, a single human shout, Jake's voice, so raw and close it made the hair on my arms stand up. "Ethan," he called. "Help." Relief ripped through me so violently I forgot to be afraid for a second. I shouldered forward, every step a promise, and then the canyon answered with a sound that was not relief but a kind of guffaw, like rocks laughing at a child's attempt at bravery. The shout folded into the echo and then snapped like glass. I reached the bend and everything went black. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. I reached the bend and everything went black. Not the soft, gentle kind of black that comes with sleep, but a pressure black. Like someone had placed a hand over my face and squeezed until the world folded. My knees hit crushed stone and pain lanced up my shins. For a second, my head felt like it was full of static. I remember thinking absurdly that if you could measure the moment fear becomes memory, it would be right there. Sharp, clinical, impossible to unfeel. When I came to, the canyon had shifted again. The sky was a thin line above me, nowhere near where it had been. My flashlight, the cheap one Marcus had bought at a gas station for situational preparedness, lay half buried in sand and its rubber strap was torn. My hands were scraped raw, one of my fingers throbbed like it had been pinched, and there was a sour taste of metal in my mouth. My pack was gone. I pushed myself up and tried to orient by the small slice of sky. The walls here were slick with a darker dust, and there were marks on the stone, those same looping symbols, but more deliberate, carved deeper, as if an impatient hand had traced them with a nail. The air smelled of iron and something older, like the scent of coins pulled from a riverbed. "Jake?" I shouted, and my voice scraped out as if the canyon had sandpaper in its throat. There was an answer. Not Jake's. Something like Jake's voice warped through a speaker. It called my name, then faltered into a laugh that wasn't quite human. I stumbled forward, then stopped because the ground under my foot shifted like a living thing, and I nearly pitched into a shallow pit ringed with pebbles. In the center of the pit lay a volunteer, an old trail flag, painted in faded orange, and wrapped around it was a sliver of Jake's hair braided with dust. God help me, I vomited a little into my palm and tasted bile and copper. I crawled, hands and knees, toward a wound in the stone where the light thinned. Everything in me wanted to find Jake. Anything else felt like surrender. The path opened into a low hollow no wider than a living room, and there, half hidden beneath a ledge, was a shape. Jake. He wasn't whole. That sentence sits in my mouth like a stone. He wasn't whole the way someone might be missing a limb. He was whole and utterly wrong. He sat with his back against the rock, knees drawn up, and his head lolled as if sleep-drunk. When he moved, though, it was like watching a puppet whose strings had been cut and tangled. His face had smears of dust and something darker. One eyelid was swollen shut. He blinked at me with the other eye and smiled, and it could have been a relief if the smile wasn't wrong, too quick, too eager, like it arrived before the rest of him knew what to do with it. "Ethan," he croaked. His voice sounded like it had been underwater and then taped to a ring of metal. "You," I dropped to my knees beside him. "Jake," I said. "Jake, what happened? Where are Marcus and Nora?" He turned his head slowly, and the motion was wrong, like a slow gear grinding. "We followed the trail," he said, then coughed. He lifted his hand, and it shook in a way that made me think of wind through chimes. "We heard laughing. We thought—" He made a small, useless gesture. "We thought it was a joke." "Are you hurt?" I asked, because my own fear had to hide behind practical questions. The practical voice is a useful liar. It keeps you doing things. Jake tried to stand and nearly fell. He pressed a palm to a smear on his shirt and looked at it as if seeing it was the crime. It was dark and tacky. "I tried to follow Marcus," he said. "He went ahead, then the canyon." He spread his fingers and the motion looked ceremonial. "It took a path. I think I saw something. Then—" He closed his eyes and hissed as if something inside him had been nicked. We had to move. There was no other plan. Not really. I helped Jake to his feet, supporting him so he could take a few unsteady steps. He leaned on me as if I were a cairn he'd trusted for years, and for a moment I believed that whatever had happened could be solved by moving forward. The canyon, of course, had other ideas. As we progressed, the walls tightened, and the echoes returned. My breathing bounced back at me like a stranger, and Jake's footsteps sounded like dozens of little hands scurrying across a drum. Halfway through a constriction, we heard them. Faint at first, then closer. A chorus of voices. Not words, but syllables that slid over one another, punctuated by wet breaths and the tap of nails on stone. The sound came from the ledge above us, and when we looked up, we saw them, small shapes clinging to the overhang like nests of ragged laundry. At first, I thought they were animals, maybe bats whose wings had been shredded, but they had faces. They were faces that looked like faces we've seen in passing, long-lost hitchhikers, roadside portraits, smeared and familiar at the same time. One of the shapes turned, and its eyes, if you could call them that, fixed on Jake. It laughed, and the laugh was the worst thing I'd ever heard. A child learning to mock a cough. Jake's knees gave, and for a terrifying heartbeat, I thought he would collapse. Instead, he stopped and smiled that smile again, the one that was wrong. Then he tilted his head and began to repeat, in a slow, echoing voice, the words the shapes were making. "Come, come, come." The canyon joined in, like a congregation responding with a practiced chorus. I grabbed Jake's arm and pulled, wrenching him away from whatever small gravity the ledge had on him, but the thing in him persisted. He pulled back like a prize animal resisting a leash. His eyes rolled, and when he spoke, it wasn't fully his voice. We are the ones who wait," he mouthed, and I felt the marrow of me shake. I don't know how long we moved like that, half carrying, half dragging, trying to put distance between us and the ledge full of faces. Every so often, Jake would stop and laugh softly to himself and then whisper numbers, random sequences that had no meaning and yet felt like coordinates. 14, 3, 27. He whispered them like a mantra. At some point, because exhaustion is a thief that moves quietly, I slumped against a bead of rock and hung my head. The world tilted, and for a second I thought of the gas station back home, the fluorescent glare, the man with the cigarette who'd said, "Watch the ground." All the advice in the world felt like a child's thread. "Marcus," I said aloud, and for a fleeting second I believed if you spoke a name enough, it would answer. The canyon answered with a sound that might have been Marcus laughing, or might have been the grinding of stone. The difference seemed irrelevant. We crested a low ridge, and there on a flat shelf, like a stage where the canyon performed its cruelties, were items, a string of watches stopped at different times, a half-burned camping stove, a child's shoe with no foot. Among them, tied to a protruding root, was Marcus's bandana. It was stained, and something else clung to it, an old photograph, curling at the edges. I picked it up. The faces were too worn to tell, but the back had a date scratched into it in a child's scrawl. It was old. Too old. Jake laughed then, ragged and broken, and the laugh slid into a sob. He pressed the bandana to his face as if to smell something only he could smell. "He went down there," he said. "He went down to the hollow. I heard him. He called. He couldn't finish. The canyon finished for him with a single wet sound like water being sucked into a throat. We had to decide what to do. We could go deeper after Marcus. We could try to climb out. There was no cell signals, no rational anchor. The canyon was an argument, and we were the undecided jury. My hands shook as I considered the options, and in the quiet, the canyon made its next move. It tapped 3 times, slow and deliberate, like the count of a judge calling sentence. I didn't realize until that moment how small the choices had become. The next step could mean rescue. The next step could mean something else entirely. I took Jake's arm and we went forward. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. We went forward. The shelf of objects still hummed in my hands, the photograph, the watches, the stove like a fossilized ribcage, and every item felt like an accusation. Jake clung to me with the desperate faith of a man who thinks being held makes him more himself. He mumbled those number mantras under his breath and kept glancing over his shoulder at the ledge of faces. The canyon seemed to lean in with us, patient and curious. "Marcus," I said again, because names are anchors in places that trade sense for sensation. The canyon answered with a sound that might have been his voice and might have been a string of pebbles knocked in time. We went toward it because the alternative, standing still and listening, felt like waiting for something to notice you first. The hollow Marcus had gone down into was darker than the other turns, a pocket that tasted of old metal. I remember dropping to my knees and pressing my palm to the dust. There were prints, our crescent tracks, the jagged little toe marks, and then the prints stopped in a neat, nervous circle. In the middle was a shallow scrape as if something heavy had been dragged and then stood up again, leaving a ring of scuffed powder. When I tilted my head, I thought I could hear the distant tap again. 3 deliberate knocks, like a code. My stomach turned. I called out, "Marcus!" My voice felt thin and ridiculous. For a moment, there was only that echo answer we had become used to. My voice bounced back at me with a delay that made it sound younger and less sure. Then, so close my teeth buzzed, Marcus answered from the dark, but his voice didn't come in words first. It came in a sound like a thing waking up. It was a release of breath and a small, wet laugh. "Marcus, where are you?" I called louder. "Down here," he said, and the relief felt like warmth. "I'm fine. I've got a light." We pushed through the narrowing, and there he was, half sitting in an alcove, a flashlight cupped in his hand. At first I thought he'd been hurt because his shirt was torn, and there was a smear of dark on his forearm that might have been blood. He smiled when he saw us, but it was the same wrong smile, too eager, like someone who decided to be brave and then practiced the expression in a mirror. "Jesus," Jake muttered, and I felt a ripple of anger because relief had been stolen from me and replaced with the uncanny. Marcus's eyes glittered in the torchlight. "You should have seen it," he said without prompting, and when he spoke, his words slipped into the rhythm of the canyon like a tune stuck on repeat. "It showed me." He reached out and his fingers brushed something tucked into the ledge. A small, pale bundle. He lifted it like a trophy. It was a child's toy, a wooden soldier with paint rubbed away at the face. "Where did you get that?" I asked. My voice hitched because the toy tasted like promise and ruin, both. "It was just here," Marcus said. "They left things. They keep things." Something about him had changed. Not in the way of injury, but in the geometry of his attention. His pupils were a little too wide. His laugh arrived like a rehearsal. He was still my friend in the sense that he had the same nose and the same stubborn jaw, but inside there was a presence that wore his skin the way a glove slips over a hand. "We need to go," Jake said, blunt and practical. Maybe that was the only sane thing left for him. Now. "We're not?" Marcus stood and bumped his shoulder against the ledge, and the canyon answered with a series of single raps, tap, 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 like applause. He looked at the rhythm and then at us with that unfamiliar smile. "They're going to show you," he said. "If you stay?" "Marcus," I said, stepping in front of him. "Whatever you've seen." Before I could finish, there was a movement on the ledge above. One of the faces, one of those things, leaned forward and rattled like a loose window. It pointed with a cracked fingernail toward the alcove where Marcus sat, then to me. Whatever the signal meant, Marcus obeyed it as if some chord had been struck inside him. His hand moved, slow and decisive, and he put the wooden soldier into my palm. "Keep it," he said. "So you remember." I wanted to say no. I wanted to tell him to stop, to wake up, to be the Marcus who once keyed a dent into his dad's truck to see how punishment felt. But the soldier was warm, as if someone had held it recently. I tucked it into my pocket because part of me wanted any piece of him that was still human. He stood up and, before any of us could stop him, he walked toward the narrowing that led deeper into the hollow. The faces leaned forward like hunger. I lunged for his arm and he shrugged me off with the ease of a man who has been persuaded before. "Go back," he said, but it was not a request. It was a tide. "Marcus!" Jake shouted. He scrambled after him, but as Marcus crossed the threshold, the canyon did something I still can't explain. It swallowed the light. The flashlight's beam pinched like a fist and then sprang back as if it had been sucked into a mouth. Marcus's silhouette slipped into the dark and then was gone. For a moment, there was nothing but our breath and the soft, obscene whispering from the ledge. Then the tapping started again, this time faster, like someone excited. I think I screamed. I think Jake and I both did. We fumbled, pushing forward until the walls closed so tight we could only move by brute force. The canyon had folded into itself in ways that made geometry irrelevant. And then, like a switch being thrown, open sky hit our faces. We tumbled out onto a flat plain where the sun had returned with ordinary indifference. The transition was so sudden I vomited from the vertigo of it. Jake and I lay there panting, sunlight like a stupid hand on our shoulders. We looked at each other. There was a raggedness to our movements, and our mouths tasted like rust. The Toyota was where we'd left it, which was impossible and yet true. The tent was still pitched, the camp chairs nested like obedient animals. There were no odd objects arranged on stones. In fact, there was nothing there to indicate we had ever been anywhere but a weekend campsite. Marcus's bandana was gone from the shelf where we'd found it. The tin can lay half buried where we'd lost it, empty and dull. We drove until the road became a ribbon of gray, and when we reached a ranger station on the outskirts of the town, we found more ordinary things. A man who took our names down with a bored expression, a phone that finally had a signal, and the long, bureaucratic pity that comes to people who report strange happenings. They took our testimony, wrote it down carefully, and then told us to rest. They said that flash floods and hallucinations were common in these places. They said the desert plays tricks. The forms they made us sign had boxes for mental confusion and environmental exposure. The smallest box you can imagine for something as big as what had happened. They sent out a team the next day. Search dogs, men with ropes and radios, people wearing the certainty of training like armor. They combed the wash until the sun was tired. They found prints at the mouth of the canyon where we'd entered, ours, and then other impressions that bent at strange angles. They found some scattered objects, watches, a child's shoe, things whose provenance could not be proved. They did not find Marcus. They did not find the neat, ringed scrape where he'd vanished. The official report would later say no conclusive evidence. They filed it carefully in a drawer where many strange things go to be politely forgotten. We were left with the things you can't file away. Jake's twitching at night, the way he whispers numbers like prayers, the way he looks up when he hears tapping in a pipe or a radiator, the way my hands sometimes itch to trace it, those looping symbols where dust collects on the windowsill at home. I went back to the canyon once, months later, with the empty legal permission of someone who wants proof. The wash was just a wash, sun-baked and indifferent. I found the tin can where we'd left it. It was empty. People asked if we'd been drinking. People asked if we'd been high. People asked if maybe we'd made the whole thing up for attention. The answers sit inside me like stones. No, and I wish we had. I have nightmares that are more like memories. Marcus's smile, the faces on the ledge, Jake listing numbers like coordinates, the tapping that sometimes comes through my apartment pipes at 3 a.m. and makes my teeth ache. Sometimes when the house is too quiet, I hold the wooden soldier in my hand. It is small and smooth from use, paint chipped where a finger once worried at it. I tell myself, it's just a toy. I tell myself that the canyon is a place with tricks and gullies and lonely things. Then, because stories have the blunt power of habit, I tell it to the dark anyway. If you're sitting by a fire somewhere, thinking about taking a shortcut through a wash because the map looks charming and unclaimed, don't. Let the canyon keep its secrets. The desert asks for curiosity as a toll. Sometimes it pays you back. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. This story is over. Get ready for the next one. My name is Ethan Cole. I was 32 when it happened, the night I keep replaying in my head, and the date was October 14th, 2019. I don't tell this story to impress anybody or to chase clicks. I tell it because it still hangs in the air around me like dust after a windstorm, impossible to sweep away. If you picture the kind of trip where four friends go out to push a little distance between themselves and the city, that's what this was. We wanted red rock and open sky, something to remind us we were small and alive. We got more than we bargained for. There were four of us. Me, practical, a little too cautious. Marcus Hale, who could charm a rattlesnake into shedding its skin. Lena Ortiz, my girlfriend then, who loved maps and old roads. And Tom Anders, who carried a pocket knife like it was a talisman against boredom. None of us were outdoorsy pros. We could set up a tent without hurting anyone's feelings and cook freeze-dried chili without starting a forest fire, but that was about it. We had one rule: no heroics, no daredevil nonsense. We laughed about that rule twice before the trip was over. We drove out of Phoenix at dawn with coffee and a playlist of songs we'd heard 100 times. The highway gave way to 2-lane roads, then to dirt. Our destination was a place Marcus found on an old hiking forum. A stretch of plateau the locals called Red Mesa Hollow. It wasn't marked on the state maps. Only a handful of photos existed, and those were grainy and taken in a way that made the land look like something from a dream. Jagged silhouettes, a ribbon of sky, and an abandoned stone foundation in the middle of nowhere. The forum poster had written in a half-joking way about strange lights over the mesa and the bones of an old miner's cabin. Marcus, who liked mystery with a side of danger, booked us 2 nights. We set up camp in an elbow of the mesa where the wind pressed the junipers flat. The first day evaporated into small pleasures. A wrong turn that led to a dry creek bed with bright turquoise stones, Lena sketching the horizon, Tom trying to convince us that the foundation belonged to an outlaw who'd buried a chest full of pre-war coins. We built a fire, told stupid stories, and watched constellations rearrange themselves like an audience clearing their throats. The moon was thin and polite. Somewhere, a coyote yipped like a single bell. Before we went, I researched the area. You know how once you read just enough about a place to feel like you own it? I found a handful of references to Whispering Butte, a local name for the highest promontory that leaned over the hollow. The whispers, according to an old hunting blog I found, came from wind through narrow crevices. According to a late-night message board, they were voices. The more I read, the less certain I felt about which I preferred. Marcus loved that kind of ambiguity. He would point at a rock and concoct stories about whoever might have carved it, who might have left a rusted skillet behind, who might have wanted to be found. Lena, more skeptical, would roll her eyes and sketch anyway. Tom, who liked being useful, spent the afternoon chopping kindling and giving weather reports as if he were anchoring a storm that was still weeks away. I drove the truck to the lip of the mesa and tried to photograph the valley, the way the red stone folded into itself. I kept thinking about small noises, the way a twig snaps, the way a distant animal screams, and telling myself they were just sounds, ordinary and explainable. That's another thing about fear. You prepare a narrative for it. It's just wind, you tell yourself. It's just coyotes. You practice the lines. On our second evening after a long day of exploring, we sat around the fire and ate from foil dinners. The foundation, the one from the pictures, was a half-mile away, a neat square of stone that looked like someone had dropped a pocket of civilization and left. Marcus wanted to go look at it after dark because he thought ruins were more romantic at night. Lena said it would be cold and pointless. Tom volunteered to hold a flashlight like a movie extra. I should have been the one to say no, but the firelight made us small and brave, and the road back to that ruined foundation felt like a dare. We walked carefully. and feet in rhythm with each other. The air had that desert October crispness that makes breath visible for the first time. The stars were bold and distant, and the mesa rose up around us like a dark amphitheater. The foundation looked different at night, edges sharper, the ground around it deeper in shadow. It had a low doorway, as if it had swallowed a person, and then chosen to forget them. We laughed at our nerves when Lena peered into that shadow and said she thought she could smell coal, like the breath of a furnace that had long since gone out. This is where the story proper begins, the thing I still wake up replaying in all kinds of light. It doesn't begin with a scream or a monstrous reveal. It begins with a sound so simple I'll never be able to unhear it. A soft, deliberate scraping, like a boot drawn slowly across stone, coming from inside the foundation. My first reaction was practical, someone else on the mesa, a lost hunter, a drifter. The second reaction, the one that lives in my chest when I close my eyes, was less sensible. The scraping stopped, then started again, closer to the doorway. Lena's hand found mine, a small, hot anchor. Tom whispered something about probably a bobcat. Marcus breathed out a laugh that tremored. We edged forward because people do, because curiosity and fear are the same muscle, and we had trained it all afternoon. When we peered into the doorway, the flashlight beam hit something that looked like a shadow that had learned to stand up. It was not an animal. It was not a person we recognized. It was, bafflingly, a large bundle wrapped in something old and dark. The scraping came from inside that bundle, a tiny metallic sound, like someone dragging a ring over a tin can. I felt my mouth go dry. Marcus stepped back. Tom swore softly. Lena breathed, and it sounded like someone filling a balloon halfway. There are 1,000 ways to explain what we saw next, but none of them make it easier. The bundle moved, not like a rabbit or like wind. It shifted as if someone inside it was waking up and testing the skin of the sack around them. Then something small and pale, a hand maybe, or a strip of fabric, slid free and touched the edge of the doorway, as if finding purchase. I don't want to pretend I was brave. I was not. But there's also a part of me that regrets the small, stupid courage that kept me from running. I reached out with the flashlight again, and the light caught on something written on the inside wall of the foundation. A name, maybe, or a date. The letters were scratched and old, and one of them looked like an X. We should have left then. We didn't. We stepped closer, and what followed is the piece I can't let go of. A sound, a smell, and a face that did not belong to any map I had ever held. The face looked at us from inside that bundle, and for a second that I swear lasted forever. The desert was a wide hole, and we were small things at its edge. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. The face in the doorway wasn't a face the way you expect one to be. It was an accumulation of too many small, wrong things. The skin hung like thin paper. The eyes were the color of old milk, and there was a suspicion of soot in the creases, like someone had slept with their head too close to a fire for years. When it blinked, it looked surprised at the light, as if someone had swung open a curtain it hadn't known was there. It didn't speak at first. It breathed through a mouth that was cracked and wet, and the breath smelled like rusted metal and something older, like teeth and old coins. The bundle unwrapped itself with a slowness that felt deliberate. Linen and burlap fell away, and under them was a man. Not young, not quite old. Somewhere in between, with the kind of weathered face that suggested a life spent under sun and hard work. His hair was scraggly, and there were cuts along one cheek that looked like they'd been cauterized by wind. "Who are you?" Marcus stammered. My own voice came out thinner than I felt. The man's mouth moved. His voice was a rasp, like someone talking through a throat full of sand. "Ethan," he said. It wasn't a question. He said my name like an anchor pulled through the dark. Lena sucked in a breath that I could hear, and both Tom and Marcus looked at me the way people look when they're trying to read a word written in a language they just learned. I had never met this man. I had never told anyone my name except the three of them and family. My heart did something stupid and loud. "Do you know him?" Lena asked, voice small. The man's eyes darted from face to face, stopping on Marcus, then Tom, as if he was checking a roster. "Not him," he whispered, and then, for reasons I still don't understand, he laughed. It was a short, wet sound that didn't belong to anyone who knew the sound of a proper laugh. Not him, not yet. Tom, the practical one, took a step forward with the arrogance of people who think they can solve any problem with a bandage and a question. "We can help you. You're hurt. Do you need water?" The man's head tilted as if he hadn't heard the word help in a long time. He pushed himself upright, muscles thin but capable, and he reached down into the remains of the bundle. For a second, I thought he was reaching for something to defend himself with, but his hand closed on a small dented tin, the kind you'd carry to store tobacco or matches. He opened it with a fumbling motion, and inside was a small, tarnished token. It was round and marked with an X. He pressed the token into my palm before I knew what I was doing. It was warm and slightly sticky. On it, the X wasn't scratched. It was a shallow seam, as if two halves had been joined, and then the join left a permanent mark. "Don't bring it to the lip," he said, eyes briefly meeting mine. "Don't bring it to the lip when there's moon." "What does that mean?" Marcus asked. He sounded excited, like a man whose curiosity was a spark and who still hadn't learned what fire could do when it ate everything. The man's gaze slid away, and for the first time I noticed that the foundation's stones were carved with letters and numbers and, bizarrely, tiny pictographs of things. Fish bones, a small house, a half moon. He scratched at one symbol with the tip of his finger, then looked back at us. "It remembers names," he said. "It remembers what you say when you sleep." That night, we brought him back to camp. We had no right to, really. The sensible course would have been to call for help, but there was no cell signal, and our truck was parked too far away for any patrol to care. So we did what 4 people in the desert do when faced with immediate human need. We made a decision born of pity and hubris. We laid a blanket by the fire and gave him equal parts water and canned peaches. He ate with both hands like someone tasting food for the first and the last time. He told us a little, not a full story, but scraps. He said he'd been wandering for months, had lived in the hollow, and that once, a long time ago, a small group had tried to dig under the Whispering Butte. They found a seam, and then they found things that should not be. "We told them to stop," he said, smiling without amusement. "They said digging was how you get a future." His eyes were flat when he said the last word, like a man recalling a joke that had gone wrong. We listened because there wasn't much else to do. The night wrapped around us and every small sound grew larger. The coyotes sang a lonely chorus line cry. Once in the far distance, I thought I heard a scraping, that deliberate sound again, but it could have been a rock shifting or the subtle creak of the earth settling. The man slept fitfully, arms curled over the tin token. When he dream-shivered, his lips moved and he whispered names, not ours, except for that first eerie breath. Names that sounded like family and old debts. Sometime after midnight, I woke to a noise at the edge of the camp. I lay still and watched the coals breathe. Then the sound repeated, a soft, calculated touch against stone, like someone tracing the outline of something they wanted to remember. I put my boots on and went to the tent flap. The moon had slipped behind a faint cloud, and the shape of the mesa looked like a suggestion instead of a thing. The air smelled metallic and old. Our truck was where we'd left it, but the compass I carried on my keyring, a silly charm from Lena, spun in a way that made my skin feel cold. It didn't align with north. It spun slowly at first, then faster, and then stopped as if it had decided it was tired. I stepped away from the tent and toward the foundation, drawn by the same muscle that had put me at that doorway in the first place. The closer I got, the more I felt like the world had shifted a degree or two on its axis. There were footprints around the foundation, not our prints, small barefoot prints that ended at the lip of the stone and then started again a few feet away. The token in my pocket thudded against my thigh. I didn't remember putting it there. Then I heard Lena call my name in a voice threaded with panic. I ran back. The man was gone. The blanket lay folded exactly where we had left it. The tin token, the one he had pressed into my palm, had been wiped clean and left at the foot of the fire, resting on a stone we had not used before. Around it, in the ash, were tiny scratches in a circle, like someone had drawn a crude gear. Marcus swore and pointed to the rim of the camp where the juniper branches had been snapped, as if something had pushed through them from the inside. We searched until dawn. We called the man's name until the sound of our voices became a part of the mesa's morning. There was no sign of him on the trail, no blood, no drag marks. Only the token remained, and the feeling that the land had listened and then turned away. By the time the sun climbed high and the red stone warmed under its attention, the sensible part of my brain had started to stitch together explanations. He could have wandered off. He could have been someone with friends. He could have left to tend some work we couldn't see. But another part, the part that still wakes me when the wind is in a particular way, knew better. The token was a promise, not a key. The marks in the ash looked too deliberate to be anything but a message. That day, the rest of our trip changed shape. We kept to Camp Moore. We left the ruins alone. But at night, the scraping returned, softer than before and always at the same rhythm. Once, Lena dreamed and woke whispering a sentence in her sleep that made Tom white as a sheet. They like the names. We should have gone home then. We should have packed the truck and driven like the desert itself was behind us. We didn't. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. After that day, the four of us stopped pretending we were on a normal camping trip. We still ate, still joked in short, brittle bursts, but the jokes landed weird. The desert felt smaller and closer, like a room with the walls nudging inward. The token sat heavy in my pocket most of the time, its seam warm against my thigh as if it had absorbed skin heat and refused to let go. Sometimes I would take it out and trace the X with a thumb just to remind myself it was an object, not an oath. Marcus changed first and fastest. The easy confidence that had been his coat since college thinned and frayed into something else. Hunger, mostly. He started waking earlier, wandering the perimeter of the camp as if scenting the air for something only he could detect. When he spoke, it was less in sentences and more in clipped puzzles. Names, he would say, turning the token between his fingers like a worry stone. They keep wanting names. He stopped asking where the man had gone and started asking whether we had spoken our full names aloud after dark. Lena, practical and steady, tried to keep us anchored. She began sketching again, but her lines grew sharp and uncertain. Her dreams were no longer simple recollections of road trips. She would wake scribbling words in the margins of her sketchbook that she didn't recognize later, raw syllables that looked like they belonged to dust and old wood. Tom, who had once made us laugh by pretending to be a forecaster, began keeping a small hand-scrawled log of noises, times, directions, the character of a scrape or a sigh. He called it science, and we let him. We did try to leave once. On the third morning, Boots hit the truck bed and the engine complained like something waking from a long nap. The battery was fine. The tank had fuel. The starter turned and turned, but the engine would not catch. For a second, I believed in ordinary things again. A bad starter, a loose cable. Marcus swore and popped the hood like he could coax logic out of a machine. Tom fiddled with connections. The starter made a sound like it was trying to remember how to be a starter. When it died, there was a thin, metallic note in the air, like the scraping had changed keys and added a choir. We hiked back to the foundation to see if a broken wire could be explained away by a chewed cable or a rodent. Daylight makes lies simpler to tell yourself. The foundation was silent and yawning like a mouth that had stopped speaking because no one had listened. There were new scratches on one inner wall, fresh cuts in the stone that hadn't been there the day before. When I moved the flashlight across them, my breath forgot to fall. There, carved with an unsteady hand, were 4 names, not full names, just first names, deep and impatient. The letters had edges that glinted in the light. Ethan, Marcus, Lena, Tom. I'd sworn I didn't believe in fate, curses, or anything that asked for a signature. Seeing my name etched into rock, something that took ages and effort, felt like being accused. Marcus ran his fingers over his carved name and smiled in the way people smile when understanding something terrible. "It knows us," he whispered. Tom wanted to chalk it up to someone's twisted prank. "Whoever was here could have carved them," he said. He sounded like a kid who'd been caught with cookie crumbs and denied the theft. But there were no other prints. No boot marks circling the foundation, only the small barefoot marks that sometimes appeared at night, like punctuation marks from something that walked without shoes. We argued after that, softly, bitterly, the way people who once shared playlists now divide over details. Marcus wanted to find out more. He wanted to return to the lip of the mesa at sundown and listen. Lena wanted us to pack the truck and get as far away as possible. Tom tried to be nowhere at all, as if absence could be a shield. I found myself somewhere in the middle, compelled by guilt and curiosity in alarming equal measure. That night, the scraping learned new rhythms. It was always there, a metronome I couldn't set aside. Around midnight, the man's absence finally stopped being a blank space and started being a presence. Not a body, but a suggestion, a voice left on an answering machine. Marcus, who had been staring at the token for hours, stood up and walked away from the fire without explaining. He said simply, "If it remembers names, I'll give it one to hold." He didn't ask permission. He didn't even look back. I followed him because fear and loyalty are sometimes the same thing. We climbed a narrow path that led to a shelf of rock overlooking the hollow. The moon had decided to show itself that night, a fat coin between the clouds. At the lip, the air tasted metallic and tight. Marcus stood inches from the drop, token in hand, and he did the most reckless thing. He spoke aloud, not his name, but two names folded together, his mother's and his sister's, names he had whispered into pillows in the dark years before. The token gleamed in the moonlight as if it had been polished. A whisper returned, so soft I thought it was my own breath. It echoed off the stone and multiplied, like the mesa was answering in its many thousand-throat voice. At first it was a syllable, then became a sentence. The names again, stitched into air, then something that sounded like a thank you or a claim. The ground hummed like a throat clearing. Marcus smiled as if relieved. I remember thinking then that whatever it wanted the sound of us. He turned to walk back and the world did something sickening. The edge of the mesa, the lip we had walked along for the sake of a view and a photograph, altered. It was still a ledge and still raw with stone, but a small vertical seam opened in the space between two boulders, like a door easing on its hinges. From within that seam, a pale hand emerged. Not long, not fierce, but human enough to make my knees go thin. The hand curled around Marcus's ankle and hung on, as casual as a person grasping a railing. Marcus didn't scream. He laughed, a short sound of surprise. He lifted his foot as if testing wind resistance, and the hand tightened. Then, with a muscle-shaking pull, the seam took him. He didn't fall. He slid as if the lip had swallowed him gently, the way a tunnel might take a cord inside a wall. Marcus's face remained level as he looked back at Lena, Tom, and me. His mouth shaped the word go, and then the rocks closed. We ran, we banged on the seam, we hit stone with palms until the skin split and the nails broke. The seam was cool and immovable. It was as if the land had simply reasserted itself and decided that nothing had just happened except for the memory of 4 people who had seen it. For a long time, we just stood there, ragged and stupid, the token heavy in my hand like an accusation. When the stone gave no further answers, we staggered back to camp and did the one thing that made us feel less useless. We tried to make a plan. We could call for help. We could dig at the lip until someone came. We could stay and wait and hope that Marcus had been misplaced rather than taken. None of those options felt honest. The token in my palm pulsed almost like a heartbeat. We kept watch that night in shifts, but the thing that watches you in the desert is patient and has more time than any human. At 3 a.m, Lena woke me with a quiet that was not her normal voice. She had found something by the fire, a fresh scratch in the ash, a neat X smaller than the token's seam, and beside it, a scrap of burlap that smelled like the man who had been with us and wasn't. It was as if someone had left a calling card and then walked away. We did not sleep again that night. We listened for scraping and for a name. The thing we feared most had already proven it preferred subtlety. It did not want to scream us into action. It wanted to write us into the margin of a map we couldn't read. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. We moved like people who've been given one too many chances and know better than to waste them. The morning was brittle and clean, the kind of light that makes everything look like it will keep its promises. We gathered what we could: rope, a shovel, the dented tin token, Lena's sketchbook filled with those half-formed words, Tom's trembling notebook, and went back to the foundation. Whoever carved our names had not bothered to finish. The letters were still raw and impatient, like fresh wounds. The token felt heavier than it had the night before, as if it had been storing a small, steady gravity. We argued. We argued in small, sharp bursts, that made the mesa feel smaller. Tom wanted to call someone. There was finally a weak bar of signal on our phones. Marcus was, well, he was gone. It was as simple and as terrible as that. Lena's hands shook when she spoke. "We can't bargain with something we don't understand," she said. Her veneer of reason was wearing thin. "What if it takes someone else? What other choice do we have?" I asked. The token warmed in my palm. I could feel the seam like a small fault line, the way a good blade will take a bloodline. We can't leave him. The man who had appeared in the foundation, the one who'd given me the token and whispered my name, had told us things in fragments. He'd said the Mesa remembers and that names were the currency. He'd said, in a voice that sounded like gravel, that some bargains were older than hunger, and that the Mesa liked a sound as payment. We had dismissed him as a riddle teller, then paid for that dismissal with Marcus. Now, with the tin between my fingers, those fragments rearranged into a shape that looked dangerously like a plan. There was risk. There was always risk. The man's warning, "Don't bring it to the lip when there's moon," had a meaning I only fully understood in blue-white daylight. The lip was where the seam had swallowed Marcus, and the seam had opened when the moon made itself a coin in the sky. If the moon altered the seam, perhaps the sun unmade it. If names called it in, maybe names could call it back. We waited until the moon had shrunk to a thin thing and the sun had not yet decided whether to rise, that soft hour when the world is a promise and also something you could be traded for. We carried the token to the lip and set it gently on the boulder where Marcus had been taken. Lena read from her sketchbook, not words as you or I would read them, but the strange syllables she'd woken with, the half names the man had whispered in his sleep. Tom stood bolt upright and recited times and directions, like a man reading a will. I should have turned away when it came to my name. I almost did, but that would have been the same as leaving. "I'll give it," I said. "I'll give my name." Lena's hand closed over mine so hard her knuckles whitened. "No," she breathed. "No, Ethan, don't." "You heard him," I said. "He said it remembers what you say when you sleep. If it eats names, if it takes them, then giving it one back." My voice broke on the last syllable. Marcus's face flashed in my head. The way he'd smiled when the seam took him. The way he'd mouthed, "Go." It had been both command and plea. Tom made a sound that was equal parts plea and protest. "There has to be another way," he said. But his hands were empty and his voice thin. The land held all the better arguments. I spoke my name out loud the way someone signs a check or a contract. Ethan Cole. I said it twice, then 3 times. Each repetition feeling like a stitch being taken out. The token grew hot as if some small sun burned just beneath its seam. The little X glowed a dull ember red, and the air thickened with a smell like old pennies and rain on dry stone. Lena started to cry quietly. Tom swallowed and pressed his palms together like someone praying to a god with no mercy. I laid the token in the seam where Marcus had been taken, and then, because words for bargains are stubborn things, I said the names we wanted returned. Marcus Hale, Lena Ortiz, Thomas Anders. I said them like offerings. The rock hummed, a deep, pleased vibration like a throat purring. The seam opened, not violently, but as if a mouth were making room for someone to come home. Stones slid like breath, and somewhere under the wind there was a sound like a small, surprised laugh. Marcus fell out first. He hit the ground on his back, coughing and gasping as if someone had punched a hole in him and emptied the pull of air into the earth. He was dirty, his clothes shredded, his face a map of small cuts. He looked smaller somehow, hollowed like a pumpkin after someone scooped out the soul. He blinked at us as if his eyes were reluctant to hold more than a few seconds of light at a time. "Ethan?" He said my name, a question that felt like a child's. "Where am I?" Lena screamed and flung herself at him, sobbing. Tom was on his knees, shaking him as if a slap could press whatever had been taken back into the bones. Marcus stared at me with a look that was grateful and empty all at once. He touched his chest, then mine, like a man checking for closure. For a blessed minute, it seemed like a miracle, like someone had rewound a wound. Then I understood what I had given. When we walked back to camp, the small things at first told me it had been worth it. Marcus talked in fits and starts and remembered the taste of canned peaches. He hugged Lena and kept apologizing. Tom laughed too loudly to keep his hands from trembling. But the world rearranged slowly, and I began to notice the absences. My sister didn't answer my late-night calls. My mother, when I called on the way home, asked which Ethan I was and then said, kindly but with a polite confusion, "I don't know an Ethan Cole." My friends' phone books were blank where my name had been. Pictures of me on social media were tagged with a username that wasn't mine or had no caption at all. Emails I'd sent had no replies, as if they'd never left. Lena's voice broke when she admitted she had to reach into the memory of our first date to make it come alive, and even then, details felt like gravel, rough and shiftable. Marcus remembered me. Tom remembered me. Lena remembered me. They'd shared the seam and knew what had been traded. But outside of that fragile circle, I was a blank on the paper. The token was gone, the seam closed like a mouth again. The foundation's inner wall bore a new carving, small and neat, deep as a promise and as final as a signature. Ethan, X-10-14-2019. It felt like being memorialized while the rest of the world unread the plaque. I learned to live with the quiet erasure. I learned the small cruelty of calling my mother and hearing a hesitation, the polite confusion of people who meant nothing unkind but could not place me. I learned to watch the way people with ordinary calendars moved through days that didn't include me. And in the nights when the wind leaned funny against the house, I would think of that seam and the man with the tin and the cold coin of the token. Marcus recovered enough to move out west, pulled by something that smelled of second chances. Tom took a job far away and writes to me sometimes, his handwriting shaky, as if he's still learning to hold a pen after what we watched. Lena and I stayed for a while, then pack-and-go life tugged at her antsy feet. We tried to build back ordinary, dinners that weren't survival rations, a job that paid bills. People let us back in small increments. They put Marcus on a birthday card and sent Tom a dog sweater for Christmas. They did not mostly remember me unless something stirred in them that shouldn't. Sometimes, late at night, I walk to the place where the world remembers names and touch the stone in my palm, feeling for warmth that isn't there. I still have that memory like a ring around a finger. I still keep a notebook with the names I remember, not to trade, but to remember that names are not just words, they are anchors. The thing we bargained with listens, and I do not pretend that bargains are fair. I made a trade to bring a friend back. I would do it again, even knowing the small thievery of being forgotten by people who never meant to lose me. If you take anything from this, and you probably will take only the part that chills you, remember it isn't only the bright terrors that cost. Sometimes the price is a soft, polite forgetting. Sometimes paying for a life is giving up your place in the phone book. This is my story. Marcus laughs in a way that will make you think he is cheerful when he calls. Tom draws weather charts and refuses to camp in the desert again. Lena writes maps and leaves my name in the corners of them, small and bold. And me, I tell the story whenever I am asked in the hopes that saying it aloud will keep me from being trading away twice. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. This story is over. Get ready for the next one. My name is Lucas Whitman. I was 28 years old when it happened, the night of August 14th, 2019. I remember the date because it was supposed to be a turning point, a long weekend to get away from the city, from the paperwork and the dull ache that had been following me since my father died. We drove out to Arizona with that kind of hope you put in a duffel bag, a map, a cooler, and a false sense of control. We picked Juniper Ridge because Gavin Price swore by it. Gavin is the sort of friend who collects risks like souvenirs. He works as a satellite technician and had the kind of confident laugh that made me forget deadlines for an hour. He invited two others, Tom Bishop, an ex-firefighter who could fix anything with duct tape and a prayer, and Maya Brooks, who brought a battered acoustic guitar and a habit of making coffee strong enough to rattle your bones. The four of us piled into Gavin's old truck with an extra can of gas and a stack of road trip playlists, and we left the city behind like a bad decision being closed on a file. Juniper Ridge sits above a valley they call Coyote Wash, a dry arroyo that runs hard and fast when the monsoons come, otherwise a pale riverbed dotted with sagebrush and the bleached bones of mule deer. The place is beautiful in the way the desert is, honest and indifferent. At dusk, the sky turns a ridiculous blue, and the stars show up like witnesses, cold and sharp. Gavin found a clearing near an old service road, a flat spot under a stand of twisted juniper trees with a view down into the wash. We set up tents, lit a camp stove, and told ourselves the usual stories about being small and brave and temporary. There are small details I still see if I'm not careful. The way the truck's headlights threw the shadows long and thin over the cracked earth. The smell of sage and diesel mingled, Maya's hands stained with guitar oil when she tuned between sips of bad beer. Tom unpacked an old hunting lantern and told us in a slow, deadpan way about the time his unit had to evacuate a mountain cabin in a windstorm. His voice is practical. It kept the night from swallowing us. I talked less than usual and listened more. Everyone knew why I was quiet. My father's funeral was 3 months earlier. Getting out into open sky felt like the most sensible therapy. We didn't realize Juniper Ridge had any real secrets. It did have a story, though, the kind of local whisper that migrates into guidebooks. A rusted radio tower a mile down the service road, a derelict water cistern with graffiti, the broken foundations of a miner's shack. Gavin joked about the miners as if to distract me from the way the ground tilted toward the wash. "It's just historic junk," he said, romantic in a lonely, dangerous way. We laughed and took photos at the edge of daylight, all of us posing like men who take risks but know where the line is. We agreed on a route to hike the next morning, down into the wash, across an old cattle crossing, up the far rim to a spot that overlooked a narrow canyon. We planned to be back by sundown, to have dinner and a campfire by the junipers. That night we drank, and Maya sang off-key to the stars, and Tom told the kind of stories firelight makes seem useful. We put the tents in a neat square, and Gavin left his truck keys in my pocket as some half-joke about trust. I fell asleep feeling more human than I had in months. The weather was dry and hot during the day, cooling quickly when the sun dropped. Even so, the night had a thinness to it, a sense that the landscape was listening. Around midnight, something woke me. It wasn't a sound at first, but an absence. The steady background hum you get when you're out in a place like that. Crickets, distant traffic, the sigh of the wind had narrowed to a single direction of silence. I padded out of my tent, the canvas scraping my ear, and saw Maya sitting on a folding camp chair, the lantern between her knees, the guitar across her lap. She had her head tipped toward the wash, staring into the dark like she'd seen a light someone else hadn't. "Did you hear that?" she whispered without looking at me. I told her probably nothing, coyotes or a truck on the service road. Gavin snored, oblivious. Tom was gone. I later remembered he had gone to piss and hadn't come back the way people do when something small is wrong, slow-footed and private. The moon hollowed the land into silver shadows, and in that light I noticed tracks, not coyote tracks, not deer. They were human prints that had come down from the rim, following the old road toward our clearing, then continuing into the wash like someone had walked the riverbank with purpose. We were 3 people awake and suddenly aware of how exposed we were. We checked the truck, the gas can, the doors. The prints were fresh. The soil at Juniper Ridge takes its time in cooling, and impressions hold. Gavin said it was probably hunters or kids. I believed him because belief is easier than the alternative, uninvited presence. We smoked quietly and tried to laugh ourselves back to sleep. Over breakfast, we debated whether to hike. The plan held, we would go, and the prints felt like part of the landscape, a temporary annotation, not a threat. We packed, we checked our gear. Tom had reappeared with the sun, quiet, a little too clean considering where he'd said he'd gone. He didn't have the slouch of someone trying to hide a panic, but instead carried a folded piece of paper in his pocket with the sort of grip that said he hadn't intended anyone else to see it. We left Juniper Ridge leaning on the map and a stubborn belief that daylight untangles things. For the first 700 words, I want you to know who we were and why we went. 4 people with the wrong kind of bravado, a place that looked like the edge of everything, and a date that the world would later mark for me as the moment the desert stopped being indifferent and started being deliberate. We walked with water bottles and jokes, with the old radio tower like a distant tooth on the horizon. I was carrying my father's old pocket knife for reasons I couldn't explain at the time. A small superstition. We crossed the wash and climbed toward the rim, and I remember the ordinary miracles. A hawk lifting on invisible air, a piece of obsidian catching the sunlight like a promise. At the 700-word mark, when the setup has been poured and the characters arranged like figures on a stage, the main story begins, and it begins with a sound none of us had planned for, a steady tapping coming from somewhere down in the wash like fingernails on stone. It sounded patient, as if whatever made it had time. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. The tapping kept time with my heartbeat, a slow, deliberate tick that seemed to travel along the rocks. We stopped and listened, breath loud in the hollow between us. For a moment, I thought it was an animal, a loose branch hitting stone or a trick of the wind. Then it repeated, 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks again, as if someone was reading our presence back to us. Tom was the first to move. He crouched, eyes narrowed at the ground, following a string of footprints that led toward the old cistern and the collapsed miner's shack Gavin had mocked earlier. The prints were deeper now. Whoever had walked here had something heavy on, maybe a pack. Maya hugged her guitar close like a talisman. Gavin kept trying to shake the humor into his voice, but his laugh had an edge. "You sure you saw prints?" Gavin asked, though he could see them. "The dirt there holds what you give it, proof or accusation." "Yeah, fresh," Tom said. He pulled the folded paper from his pocket and flattened it against a rock. I hadn't noticed the paper before. On it were crude notes and a map. Juniper Ridge marked with an X near the cistern, an arrow toward the wash, and a penciled name I didn't recognize, Eli Anders, with the words "Don't Wake" underlined. Tom said nothing about why he'd kept it half folded in his back pocket, but the paper fit like a missing tooth in the jaw of the place. We moved slower, the way people do when they're auditioning for courage. The wash echoed the sounds we made. Echoes in the desert don't answer back, they only repeat what you hand them. As we crested the small rise above the cistern, the tapping stopped, and the silence fell into our ears like a soft, heavy hand. The cistern was older up close. It had been capped and rusted, a hollow drum that smelled like iron and old rain. Someone had thrown a tarp over one side and propped a broken lawn chair against it. There were footprints around it that intersected ours, and a small fire ring with charred cedar. Someone had been living here recently, and not the sort of person who camps for fun. There was a shoelace tied to a juniper branch and bits of nylon webbing, a half-empty bottle of lighter fluid, and tucked beneath a rock, a cleaner that had Lucas, my name, scratched into the plastic with a pocket knife. My throat closed like someone had just put a sock in the top of it. "Who the hell would?" Gavin started. "Could be a junkie," Maya whispered. "Could be a hunter. Could be a kid playing a prank." Tom didn't look at us. He ran a hand across the ground and found a small stack of papers soaked and stuck together. He pulled them loose like peeling film. They were pages from a logbook. Days were crossed off. Names were scrawled and then erased. There were references to the radio tower. Signal bad, no light, only tap. There was handwriting that matched the lines on the paper in Tom's pocket. A tapping on a rock meant someone was there but didn't want to speak. The old miners were superstitious. Some used knots to send messages down the wash. Whoever had been here wanted to be noticed without being confronted. The message was either a threat or a warning. The difference between the two was the narrowness between the ribs. We spread out. I went around the cistern to the far side because my feet seemed to know where they should go even if my head didn't. There I found a small, weathered tin, the sort people use to hide smokes or a tiny stash of things. Inside was a photograph folded in half. A man, older, grinning at the camera in front of the radio tower with a child on his knee. Someone had written across the back in a shaky hand, "Eli and Sarah, leave them alone." The child's eyes looked like mine did before my father died, wide, trusting. I felt a slow, sickening flip in my stomach, like the world had shifted a degree on its axis. "That name?" I said. "Eli Anders?" Tom nodded. "Local. Folks say he used to work maintenance on the tower years back. Then he vanished from town after some trouble. People stopped talking about him back, but others leave offerings out here. Food, booze, little things." "Why would anyone leave offerings?" Maya asked. "To whom?" "Not to whom," Tom said. "To what? People say Eli never left. They say he lives out here now. Some of the kids call him a guardian. Others..." He swallowed, and I saw an image that made my palms sweat. A man hollowed out by solitude, wanting to be seen, and taking it anyway when he could. We argued about leaving. Gavin insisted we should go back, get the park rangers, call the number on the radio tower's maintenance board. He was the one who always wanted a chain of command. Tom wanted to search for traces. Maya wanted to keep moving toward the canyon we had planned. I wanted to go home. The desert that day held a democracy of directions, and none of them felt safe. We decided to follow the footprints further along the wash toward a narrow side canyon mapped on Tom's paper as Eli's Cut. The sun went lower and the canyon began to swallow the light. As we walked, the tapping resumed, but now it came from ahead, a softer sound, like someone knocking the side of a can in rhythm with our steps. It was methodical, patient, and not far away. About halfway down the cut, Gavin saw movement, a shadow shift, a silhouette standing just beyond a clump of brittle brush. We froze. The silhouette held something long and thin, not a rifle, but a pole of some sort, with a piece of cloth tied to the end. Whatever it was, the figure did not step from the shadow. It simply tapped its pole against a boulder and then turned the sound toward us, a small, ceremonial welcome. "Hey," Gavin called before anyone could stop him. The syllable left the world like a stone into water. The figure didn't move. The tapping stilled. For a stretch of seconds, the only sounds were our breathing and the crickets that had decided we'd earned their indifference. Then the figure stepped forward, and we saw a man in layers of mismatched clothing, his beard more white than brown, his eyes sharp as broken glass. He had a bandana tied around his neck and a hat that had seen summers. He smiled without teeth. I remember that because his mouth made a hole and his eyes filled the hole. "You shouldn't be here," he said, voice dry like the riverbed. It wasn't angry or welcoming. It was a fact. Gavin opened his mouth and said, stupidly, "We were just closing time," the man finished. He tapped his pole slowly, as if counting. "You don't listen to the wash." There was something about his posture that made Tom step backward. The man took another step, and the smell hit me. Unwashed wool, the sweetness of old wine, and something metallic beneath it like old blood. For a second, our group looked like prey, and the desert folded around the thought and swallowed it. Then, as if realizing we weren't worth the trouble, the man turned and walked deeper into the canyon. The tapping started again, but this time it wasn't meant for us. It was a cadence for something else, like someone marking time for a process that would not be interrupted. We followed at a distance, hearts in our mouths. At the mouth of a narrow alcove, the man paused and gestured with his pole to a shallow pit rimmed with stones. In the pit were lengths of cloth, feathers, and a set of old keys on a rusty ring. He picked one up and handed it to Tom without speaking. Tom's fingers closed around it like a meeting had happened between them long ago. The man's eyes flicked to me, and for the first time I felt the weight of being watched by history and not only a person. "Leave before the sky eats you," he said, and for a moment I thought he meant a literal storm. Then he laughed, a sound that didn't find the rest of us. "Leave, or the wash will keep what you bring." We left that way, with a key in Tom's hand and more questions than the desert had patience for. On the walk back, the sun sank like a coin dropped into a well, and the wash closed behind us. None of us spoke of the keys or the tin or the photograph. We walked like men who had made a bargain without knowing the terms. Night found Juniper Ridge waiting like a mouth. We returned to the camp with the cistern and the man's words in our pockets. The truck sat where we'd parked it, lights off, hood closed. But as I crossed the clearing, I saw something new cut into the bark of a juniper tree near our tents. 3 knocks, a line, and the letters "Leave." Someone had carved it while we were away. The tapping moved into my sleep that night and echoed in my head when I woke. I had the sense of a circle closing and the strong, foolish certainty that we had already stepped into it. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. We tried to sleep. None of us really did. The carved warning on the juniper, "Leave," sat behind our eyes like a promise we hadn't signed. The lantern guttered. The fire dimmed to coals that looked hungry. Around 2 in the morning, the tapping started again, thin and close, like knuckles testing a skull. It wasn't out in the wash this time. It sounded as if someone were moving around our campsite, working the edges with patient hands. Tom put on his boots without waking Gavin or Maya. He gripped the old key Eli had given him like a talisman and slid out into the dark. I told him not to go. He didn't answer. There was a kind of silence that comes before a body leaves. The air holds its breath because it knows the scene will change. Gavin and I followed at a distance. The moon was a sliver, and the stars seemed to have turned themselves away. We moved along the wash where the footsteps had led earlier, and the tapping kept time with our steps. We came to Eli's cut and found Tom standing with his back to the alcove, his shoulders tight as if he'd been carrying something. He didn't look at us when we called his name. He was watching the pit where the keys and feathers had been, and his fingers were red with the dust of the desert. Not blood, I told myself, but the color of clay and rust. "Tom," I said, "what are you doing?" He turned slowly. For a second, I thought he had done something to himself. His face was a film of something like sleep and fear mixed together. Then he smiled, and the smile wasn't his. It was a grin a man might make after being told a secret that chews the inside of you. "He's sleeping," Tom said, voice thin. "He doesn't like being woken." "Who?" Gavin asked. Tom pointed with a shaky hand into the pit. There was nothing there but the old bones of River Rock and the scraps they'd left. But it was enough. It suggested a presence. It suggested that whatever Eli was had a way of being unseen and loudly dangerous all at once. We backed away, and Tom followed like a man returning to a memory. At the rim of the wash, Eli stood in shadow, a thin figure against a darker wall. He didn't come down. He simply watched and tapped his pole once, twice, a punctuation. The sound was not a message now, but an ultimatum. "Leave," Eli said. "Leave and don't think about it." Tom laughed, a short, mad sound, then turned and walked deliberately toward the alcove. As he did, the ground seemed to take him differently, like the wash had been waiting for a particular footfall. When he reached the lip, he knelt and put his hands into the shallow pit. He began to work as if arranging something sacred. He tied the cloth tighter. He rearranged the stones. He hummed under his breath. "Tom! Tom!" Maya whispered, and it was the first time I'd heard her voice break. I grabbed him by the elbow. He was colder than the night. He looked at me with eyes that were too clear. "If you open the wash," he said, "it remembers. It remembers more than bodies. It remembers the sound of you saying your name. It keeps the last light you carried." "What are you talking about?" I said. My throat felt like sand. Gavin was at the edge of the rim, watching like an animal does when it has to decide whether to run. Tom let go of my arm and stood. He put the key into his mouth and bit at it like a child testing a coin. "He doesn't take everyone," Tom said. "He takes what needs to be kept. The wash keeps debts. Eli keeps the ledger. We were foolish." Before any of us could move, the tapping around us increased, not from the pole now, but from the stones themselves. Pebbles rolled as if nudged by invisible fingers. The air smelled colder and metallic. For a second, a figure rose from the pit like a slow tide. A tall shape that wasn't quite human, wrapped in rags and the dirt of long sleep. It moved without breaking the hush of the desert, and stood between Tom and us as if to block light. Tom dropped to his knees then and began to weep with a sound that had nothing to do with pain and everything to do with surrender. "I brought it," he said. "I brought it for him. Don't look at me like that. I thought I could bargain." "Tom, stop," Gavin said. He reached for him, but his hand trembled and stayed midair. The figure in the pit tilted its head toward Gavin like an animal assessing meat. And then, I do not know how to tell you this without making you hear the sound. The tapping slowed and became a rhythm that matched a heartbeat that was not mine. Tom's body went slack as if weight had been taken from him. He slumped forward onto his hands and didn't move. For a moment, I thought he was wrapped in sleep. Then I saw the marks on the back of his neck, where something had grabbed him, and the dark smear of dust that looked suspiciously like the imprint of the pit itself. We tried to pull him free, but it was like pulling a river uphill. The thing that had taken him had left a wetness on the stones, a residue of whatever passes between the world and the wash. In his hand, or where his hand had fallen, was the photograph from the tin. Eli's picture. The child's face was blank. Tom's fingers had tried to hide it like something you hide when ashamed. I don't remember the run back to camp. I remember only the way the desert seemed to close behind us like curtains. Maya screamed when she saw Tom's empty tent, then she screamed for him like someone calling for a name they already knew the answer to. Gavin was white and silent. He kept repeating one question over and over as if trying to stave off its arrival. Why him? Why him? We left at first light with the truck packed and the key still in Tom's pocket. The carved letters on the juniper seemed to stare. Eli watched us from the rim, his face unreadable, his pole resting on his shoulder like a captain with his mast. He tapped once, not at us, but at the wash, and then he turned and walked away into the scrub, his figure swallowed by the brand of horizon that eats people whole. Back in the city, nothing made sense. We went to the county sheriff. They came out and looked and wrote words into a report and then closed the folder with the kind of practiced care a bureaucracy gives things it can't reconcile. Tom was listed as missing. We put flyers on telephone poles. We drove the ridge for days. Friends came and searched. No sign. The wash kept its secrets. Months later, I found the photograph again in my duffel, folded and cold, where Tom must have tucked it before the thing took him. I don't know how it got there. Maybe I carried it without thinking. Maybe it found a way. The child's eyes were blank, and yet they looked at me as if accusing. Whoever the child had been belonged to Eli, or the thing that Eli kept. I was, apparently, something the wash had let go. The thing that matters is this. The tapping never really left. I sometimes hear it when I'm making coffee in the morning, a 3-knock rhythm on the side of my apartment building. Once, when I left the city to stand at the mouth of a different wash on the other side of the state, the stones wrenched against the wind in a way that felt like recognition. I have learned to listen to the silence the way you learn to read a map. People asked why we went back to Juniper Ridge after Tom disappeared. We didn't. We had no business there. What we had, what we carried, was the knowledge and the noise. Eli's tapping is a ledger and the wash is a bank. You either keep your debts small or you pay them. Sometimes, when I am very tired, I think I can feel a weight on the back of my neck, like a hand pressing to remind me. I have kept my father's pocket knife out of habit since that night, though it never cuts anything that matters. I sleep with lights low and the curtains open, because the desert taught me it likes to work in the dark. I have tried to tell the story without sounding like a man who lost his mind. People call it folklore, cautionary tale, desert madness. Maybe it is. Maybe the wash remembers more than it should. Tonight, when I tell you this, the tapping is at the edge of my hearing, and I cannot tell whether it means I should leave or whether it means it knows I'm already gone. I haven't gone back. Some debts you can carry like a stone in your shoe. Some you cannot set down until something takes them from you. This story is over. Get ready for the next one. My name is Ethan Walker. I'm 32 years old, and what I'm about to tell you happened on the night of October 14th, 2019, a night that still smells like campfire smoke in my memory. You want to know why 4 grown adults would choose the Superstition Wilderness for a long weekend in October? It was supposed to be easy. Crisp air, clear stars, the kind of silence that makes you feel both small and alive. I grew up in Phoenix, so the desert is part of me. Its heat, its stubborn scrub, the sudden drama of mesas and canyons. But the superstitions have stories that stick to a place. And we, being the kind of people who laughed at ghost stories over beers, thought it would be fun to poke the edges of legend with our hiking boots. We were a ragtag crew who'd known each other since college. Marcus Cole, always the planner, the one who triple-checked permits and sleeping bag zippers. Tyler Brooks, a tall, easy-laughing mechanic with a soft spot for bad coffee. Jenna Ruiz, a landscape photographer whose patience for light bordered on religious. And me, the storyteller of the bunch, forever turning memory into something more dramatic than it sometimes was. We called our annual escape the last blast of summer, even in October. For the rest of this story, you can remember us as those 5, and you can picture a beaten-up Jeep with a roof rack, a tarp with too many holes, and a thermos that only ever seemed to produce lukewarm coffee. Marcus picked the trail, an old, lesser-known route that left from a dusty pull-off near Apache Junction and wound toward a series of slick rock ledges above a forgotten wash. He said we'd have seclusion, good shelter from the wind, and views that will make Jenna weep. He was right about the views. We set up camp on a narrow bench that hugged a yawning drop. Sunrise over the valley was the kind of thing people use in inspirational calendars. But the bench was thin, and the scrub that kept things from tumbling off the cliff looked brittle and old. Our gear was sensible. 2 tents, a small stove, rope that Marcus swore he'd use for something cool, and a cooler with too many beers. We brought a satellite messenger because cell service is a joke in those parts. Marcus insisted. We brought a flashlight for each person, but we were careless with extra batteries. The night had a way of making you assume the best, that the desert's odd hush was only the desert doing its thing. Before the main event, there were smaller details worth noting because they were the kind of things you only see when you look back. An old rusted sign at the trailhead with a half-peeling map, a pair of boot prints near the wash that looked fresh but then disappeared toward the scrub, a quiet wind that shifted like a person moving behind a wall. Jenna, who always sensed composition in everything, kept saying the sky felt off, which is not something she usually says unless the world is really wrong. Tyler made a joke about ghosts, drinking from his thermos, and Marcus hummed a camping song he hated. That night, we ate chili and laughed at stupid memes, folding our voices into the open air until the stars took over. We were not original. There were other, quieter cues that I only later realized were not coincidental. A family of ravens watched us from a distant mesquite like somber black sentries. The desert fox that sometimes slunk close did not appear. Instead, at dusk, something else left a mark. Half buried in the sand near our stove was a fragment of pottery, brown, fired clay with a jagged edge. Jenna picked it up and turned it over in the firelight. It had old, almost faded etchings, like a child's practice with lines. We joked about treasure hunters and ancient campers. Marcus said the superstitions were full of lost things and legend. I liked that it felt like a secret, something the desert had left behind for us to find. We traded stories until the fire was a bed of coals. There is a ritual to this. Each of us would recount the scariest thing we'd heard or seen. Tyler talked about a semi he nearly collided with that had no headlights. Marcus told a tale about a prank at a frat house that ended with police sirens. Jenna's story was oddly quiet. She told of walking an empty trail and suddenly seeing a child's toy perfectly placed on a rock. She didn't laugh at her own memory. I told a story about a night driving down an old highway where the radio picked up someone else's voice, a voice that knew my name. We laughed to keep the panic from taking root. I remember thinking then that the desert was simply a stage for our bravado. There was no sinister script, and yet beneath the laughter was a mild unease, an awareness that we were inviting wildness in. Not only the wildlife, but the wildness of weather, of chance, of other people. We set watches for night hikes only half in jest, silly rituals to make the dark feel less final. Marcus insisted on sleeping with the satellite messenger on the tent floor. Jenna kept one hand on her camera even as she tried to fall asleep. By 1:17 a.m., the fire had gone out to a few cooling embers. I can say the time because later I checked my log and scribbled the moment down like a wound. That's when the main story begins. A noise that was not a coyote, not wind, not the scuffle of small paws. It started as a thunk against the Jeep's roof rack, a dull, heavy sound like something landing with deliberation. We all sat up, teeth and blankets still in our mouths. Tyler swore quietly. Marcus swore louder and ripped open the tent flap. We listened for a moment, as any sane person would, hearing the desert trying to convince us it was nothing more than rocks settling and branches rubbing. Then the sound came again, closer, and this time it was accompanied by a low, almost human-like rasp, as if someone had tried to clear their throat after a very long time without speaking. Tyler grabbed a flashlight. Jenna clutched her camera like a talisman. Marcus, by now fully awake and fatherly, told us to stay put while he looked. He moved toward the Jeep, the beam of his light skimming the scrub and making everything else a shadow play. I remember the way his light paused on the pottery fragment and then shot past it, as if something in the distance had stolen its attention. There, at the edge of the bench, in the halo of Marcus's light, was a set of prints, not just human, but oddly elongated, with a wide front and a heel that made them look like sea creatures had learned to walk on land. They led away from the Jeep and toward the wash, disappearing between two boulders as if someone had stepped off the world. That's where I stopped that night, because none of us wanted to admit the scraping sound wasn't just the desert's caprice. None of us wanted to be the one to walk into whatever those prints belonged to, and so we huddled, whispering, letting our imaginations fuse with the dark, waiting for something to give us the next move. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. Marcus's light kept moving, sweeping the desert in slow, methodical arcs as if trying to draw the dark into shape. For a split second, I saw the prints again, their long toes splayed in the sand. Marcus crouched, running his hand along one delicate ridge of sand, as if to feel whether it was a trick or a promise. He kept his voice low when he said, "Huh, that's not human." None of us had the nerve to argue. Tyler's knees knocked a soft rhythm against the cooler. Jenna's hands were white-knuckled around her camera strap. I remember thinking absurdly that the whole thing had a theatrical quality, like a set that somebody had arranged to test our reactions. Then Marcus rose and, without looking back, started following the prints. "Marcus, don't," I began, but the words died in the cold air. He was already moving, the beam of his flashlight swallowed by scrub and shadow. For a moment, none of us moved. There was a brittle logic to staying put. Don't scatter, stay together, wait for morning. Marcus was the opposite of reckless in his ordinary life. He planned, he circled, he packed extra socks. This wasn't him, and yet he went. We waited 40 minutes that felt like 40 years. The desert sounds were not comforting. The ravens had gone silent. In the distance, some kind of machinery, a miner's pump maybe, hummed like an appliance in another house. Marcus's light returned like a recall, moving faster now, searching, but without Marcus. Tyler swore and vaulted the cooler, grabbing the satellite messenger. He pushed the button for a location ping. The little device replied with a cheerful, useless bleep. No bars, no response. It was the first time I realized how fragile our little safety net really was. "Maybe he circled around," Tyler said, voice thin. "Maybe he found something and went to check the other side." He was trying to be reasonable, but he couldn't keep the edge out of his voice. "Should we go after him?" Jenna asked. Her face was pale under the camera's strap, and for the first time she wasn't the composed one framing edges of light. I could see the tremble in her jaw. I should have been the brave one. I am the storyteller. I am supposed to stand up and say, "Everything's fine, I'll go," and make the narrative work the way a nervous audience wants it to. Instead, I sat, counting syllables of fear until logic forced me off my butt. We moved as a unit, flashlights fanning outward, following a trail that seemed to tease us forward. Prints here, a scuff of dirt there, a scrap of fabric caught on a low mesquite branch like a flag. The deeper we went, the more the world narrowed to the cone of our beams and the cadence of our breaths. Not 30 yards in, we found Marcus's hat, crushed under a scrub like it had been tossed down in a hurry. My stomach dropped. The hat was one of those old baseball caps with the leather strap. He always wore it backward while hiking. The brim was ripped and dusted with a powder of red sand. Jenna picked it up with 2 fingers as if it were a relic, and in the camera's low beam, her hands trembled. Then we found the rope. Marcus had brought that jute rope, the one he'd said would be used for something cool. It lay in a loop, half buried, like a noose that had never been finished. Its fibers were frayed, as if whatever had used them had struggled free. There was a dark smear on the rope that could have been sap, could have been oil, could have been something else entirely. Tyler swallowed hard and called out Marcus's name, but the sound vanished into the wash. We followed the trail to the edge of the boulders where the prints had funneled between 2 monolithic rocks and then stopped. There was no sign of where they continued, only a patch of sand, compacted and oddly clean, like someone had stood there too long and then simply lifted off the earth. It was as if whatever had made those prints had been able to vanish the way a magician erases chalk from a board. I fumbled with my phone for light and turned it on, the way people do when the primitive things we brought with us fail to be enough. The screen illuminated something in the sand, a smear, half shadow, that when I leaned closer looked like a child's handprint, too small for Marcus's broad palms. I could taste the metallic tang of fear in my mouth. Jenna's camera, which she'd left on a low tripod, had been knocked over. She retrieved it and checked the photos. The last few images were of the bench, the fire pit, a fuzzy smear of dark where something had moved too close for the lens to catch. Then, and this is the moment that will haunt me, one image showed Marcus's face, lit by a flashlight beam, eyes wide and mouth open as if he'd seen something impossible. The quality was grainy, but you could feel the panic in the pixels. In the next frame, there was nothing. It was as if the camera had blinked and the man had been taken. "That's a trick," Tyler said, but I saw his hands shake. We called until our voices were hoarse. We shouted nicknames, snippets of joke, anything to slice through the suffocating hush. We tried to retrace our steps, but the desert offered us only a web of similar rocks and shadowy gullies that all looked the same in the flashlight. At one point, Tyler found a set of small footprints leading away from the boulders, crossing the wash, heading toward a shallow cave mouth, a mouth so black it seemed to drink the light. The footprints were not Marcus's. They were too narrow, and they had the same oddly long toes as the prints near our Jeep. The hair along my arms rose like the desert grass when a hawk passes. We considered our options with the kind of speed that fear forces on you. Wait until morning and hope Marcus returns, scatter and try to find help, follow the trail into the cave and confront whatever had taken him. Each choice carried a weight like a rock. Tyler wanted to get the Jeep and drive to a ranger station, which in daylight would have been logical. But in the dark, and with the Jeep 100 yards away, and with that odd hush creeping in, even the idea of walking back alone across the bench felt like stepping into a throat. We did the worst and bravest thing we could think of. We made a plan and then failed to follow it perfectly. Tyler and I would go for the Jeep to fetch a rope and the satellite messenger. Both were still there. Jenna stayed with the camp to keep the light and the small, fragile hope that Marcus might stumble back. Marcus's hat sat on the cooler like an accusation. The walk to the Jeep felt longer than it had that afternoon, as if the desert had stretched between us and anything safe. At one point, our flashlights caught on something moving at the edge of the wash, a blur of cloth, or maybe a shadow taking the shape of limbs. We stopped, breath lodged in our throats, and then it was gone. We picked up our pace. I thought of every scary movie in which the characters break into groups. I thought miserably that reality was more cruel than fiction. Fiction at least gives you a map to follow. When we reached the Jeep, there was more evidence that someone or something had been close. A smear on the roof rack, the dent in the windshield, still warm from a blow that had been too deliberate to be wind. Tyler slammed his fist against the cooler and swore softly. He found the spare rope beneath a tarp and the messenger tucked in Marcus's pack. It blinked once at us and then returned a hollow message. No signal. As we turned to go back, I noticed a faint trail of footprints following our own path. Small, narrow, not human. They stepped precisely where our lights had just been. It felt like a prank at first, some elaborate jape. Then I realized no one could have been that close, mirroring us step for step without us feeling them. The desert was mocking us with a ripple that looked like companionship but wasn't. We ran back toward the camp, the rope coiled in Tyler's arms and a cold certainty settling into my bones. When we burst back into the light of Jenna's lantern, she was standing with the camera pressed to her chest, eyes rimmed red. There were 3 words in the hush between us before she could speak anything more. "You were in it." "You what?" I asked, fighting the urge to sound rational. "You were in the camera." She waved the LCD screen at me, fingers trembling. "Not now. Earlier. The one before Marcus's face. You, looking at the trail. But your face was wrong. Your eyes were black in the pupils, and there was something behind you in the sand, like a shadow with a shape." I thought of the times we'd laughed that night, the stories we'd told. I thought of the way light can lie. But Jenna's eyes were not lying. They were narrowed as if to hold the world steady. We realized, together and at the same quiet, that this was not merely a missing friend. This thing, whatever it was, had been close enough to be caught on film. It had been close enough to toy with us. It had been close enough to step into the prints left by our own boots and pretend it belonged there. We didn't sleep that night. We sat in a ring with the coals cold between us, the rope stretched like a fragile promise. The desert around us felt larger, deliberate. Every twig break made us turn, every breeze sounded like a voice. At 3:03 a.m., something came walking the bench. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. Marcus's footsteps stopped like a record scratched in a jukebox. The sound that came walking the bench didn't belong to any animal I knew. It was a slow, deliberate pad, the galloping silence of something enormous moving very carefully. Our flashlights carved the night into thin, trembling fingers, and the world beyond them was only suggestion. "It wants us to see it," Jenna whispered, and her voice came out like someone trying not to wake a sleeping thing. The steps drew closer, circling the camp with the patience of tidewater. Wherever it walked, the sand shifted in a way that left no wind ripples, but left prints like stubs of flippers. The prints were half human, half boats, and they stopped at the edge of our circle of light, as if whatever had walked them respected a boundary we'd mistakenly thought was ours to keep. Marcus's name had been at the back of our throats all night. Now it rose like a prayer. We called again, but the thing that walked the bench answered with a faint, hollow echo that sounded like our voices reflected through a long tunnel. For a heartbeat, I thought I heard Marcus's own voice answer us from inside that echo, his laugh, short and wrong. But it could have been a trick. Tyler tightened the rope around his hand like a talisman. "We go together," he said, and it sounded like an order that belonged to the old functional part of him that changed oil and fixed brakes. I nodded. Jenna swallowed and kept the camera held like a shield. We moved, slow and deliberate, toward the bank of boulders where the prince had disappeared. At the mouth of the shallow cave, the air felt colder, wet in a way the desert should not be in October. The flashlight beams trembled as if the batteries themselves were afraid. The cave wasn't deep, more of an overhang, but beneath it, the earth sloped and the darkness tasted thick. In the sand, there were more of those prints, and between them, the faint impression of a human knee and the smear where a hand had dragged across the stone. "Marcus?" I called. My voice broke in the middle of the name as if it were too heavy to say. Something moved in the bone black inside. Then Marcus stepped out. He wasn't right. He still had his hat, though the brim was torn, and his jacket hung off him like he'd been shrunk in the wash. There was dried sand along his forearms and a line across his cheek as if something had brushed it. But his eyes, the thing I remember first, were not how Marcus's eyes had ever been. They were too dark, as if the pupils had swallowed the color of the irises. When he looked at us, there was a patient, detached curiosity in him, like a scientist looking at ants. "Guys," he said slowly, and the sound was Marcus but softened, as if muffled by dozens of miles of desert. "You shouldn't have come." Tyler moved forward and grabbed him like he meant to steady a drunken friend. Marcus didn't resist. He smelled faintly of dust and something sweet and sour I couldn't place. Jenna's camera shutter clicked, though she wasn't sure why. The instinct to record had taken on a life of its own. "What happened?" Tyler demanded. Marcus blinked once. "It told me things." His voice was flat. "It told me how to walk where there is no path and how to be invisible in the ruts of the world. It told me my name, and then it told me to go home." "Home?" Jenna echoed. Marcus's jaw worked. "It wanted someone to follow me back. It wants company." He smiled, but the movement didn't touch his eyes. The rope that we'd brought lay forgotten on the sand. For the first time since the prince, there was a rational solution. Take him back to the Jeep, call the ranger, drive out, and never look back. Tyler grabbed Marcus's shoulder. Marcus didn't really stand. He was light, as if some part of him had been unpacked and left behind. Then Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out the pottery shard we'd found the night before. He held it like a votive, rubbing his thumb along the etchings without seeming to feel the texture. The piece seemed to glow in the weak flashlight, as if it had its own light. The etchings were not random now. They looked deliberate, symbols that were both angular and oddly familiar, like a language half-remembered. "Where did you find that?" I asked. Marcus's smile widened an inch, and something in his face was almost proud. "In the wash," he said. "But it's not just pottery. It's where something sleeps." Jenna made a sound like a small animal. "We have to get out of here, now." Her voice had regained some of its strength, but it trembled at the edges. Marcus shook his head. "You can't leave it. It likes you. It likes the noise you make with your laughs and your stories. That noise is food." Tyler pressed his palm to Marcus's chest, the old instinct to check the heart. "Ethan, is this?" Marcus laughed suddenly then, a short bark that didn't fit the world around us, and stepped back as if to show us something. Behind him, in the cave mouth, something shifted. For a moment, a contour took shape, a low hump and an array of long, slow fingers pressed to the stone like someone waiting to climb out. The flashlight caught a glint, maybe of moisture, maybe of eyes. A smell like old rain swept across our faces. I remember thinking at that precise second that whatever Marcus had been told, whatever bargain he'd made, that thing behind him was old enough to have used human faces for masks before. The prints that we'd seen were not simply feet. They were impressions left by an entirely different logic, one that could mimic the cadence of walking, but not the warmth of being. Run, I said, because sometimes the only sensible thing left is to act on the animal part of you. Tyler dragged Marcus toward the Jeep, which was 100 yards across the bench, like an island of insurance. Jenna lifted the camera and started to film, hands shaking, because recording felt like proof, and proof might be a kind of prayer. We reached the Jeep and slid Marcus into the passenger seat. He sagged in a way that made my skin crawl. Tyler started the engine on the first try, grateful for something automatic and reliable. We tore down the narrow track, and the desert behind us seemed to close up, swallowing any prints like a stone cooling over a flame. When we glanced back in the rear view, in the small mirror, there were prints marching across the bench, following a line we'd only just vacated, like someone threading a needle through our lives. Ranger station was a word we clutched to steady ourselves, but the world had other plans. The Jeep's headlights showed nothing at first, then a pair of dark shapes standing at the trailhead watching us go. They were squat and still, like garden statues, and as we passed them, one turned its head with a tiny, wrong motion. I swore it smiled. We drove until the heater was useless, and the city lights brushed our faces. The ranger office had a tired, fluorescent hum, and a woman behind the desk with tired eyes that carried all the smallness of people who had seen too many lost things. We told our story, or as much of it as we could, and names were taken, and the ranger promised to check the area with a team at first light. We were placed in separate chairs, wrapped in blankets, tasting the bitter relief of being somewhere with walls. The official report is banal. One hiker missing, no sign of foul play, animal prints, possible disorientation. They took our statements and gave us coffee we didn't want. They were kind, as institutions are when they don't yet know how to be scared. A search party combed the bench in the morning. They found footprints, yes, and the pottery shard. They found a rope snagged on a boulder. They found a knee impression. They did not find Marcus. Weeks later, after the initial search fizzled and the case became a notch in the file, we sifted through what we had left. Jenna looked through every frame she'd taken that night. In one of her photos, the image before Marcus's face, the frame that had shown me with black pupils, the background held a small, tight cluster of shadows that looked like people sitting in a circle. When she zoomed, she swore she could see the pottery shard between them, like a hearth. In another frame, Marcus's face was clearer. For a moment, very briefly, his eyes returned to the irises I knew. And behind him, in the blur of the sand, an impression looked almost like many tiny handprints overlapping, like something that had tried on the shape of hands and failed. I go back sometimes. Not often, because the superstitions keep what they're given, and the desert remembers the weight of human presence like a bruise. When I stand on the bench where we camped, listening to the wind make the same old complaints through the scrub, I feel watched in a particular attentive way. I have dreams where prints march across my bedroom floor. I have mornings when I wake with the taste of red sand in my mouth and the faint impression on my palm of etchings like the ones on that pottery shard. People ask if it's been explained. They want closure, a neat line drawn under the whole thing. We tell the reporters what we can. A missing man, a possible cave-in, hallucination under stress. But Jenna keeps shooting, and Tyler carries a small coil of rope in his truck without realizing it. I keep the pottery shard tucked in a drawer, not because it is useful, but because it feels obscene to throw away a confession. Sometimes in the dark, I think I can hear scraping, the slow, patient steps of curiosity, and I remember Marcus smiling as if he'd been given a secret he was ashamed to keep. If there is a moral to this true story, other than don't walk alone into the dark, It's that places hold their stories like a lung holds air. Some get exhaled, some stay inside. We left a piece of ourselves on that bench the way you leave a cigarette butt in a motel ashtray, carelessly, and not knowing it will be the part that never comes back. The desert taught me one last thing. Sometimes what follows you doesn't want to eat you. It just wants to be known. Sometimes that is worse. This story is over. Get ready for the next one. My name is Evan Price. I'm 28, and this happened on October 14th, 2019. I tell it like this because memory is a crooked thing. It bends and stutters when you force it to remember the cold, when you try to recall which way the moon tilted that night. I still own the same beat-up Columbia jacket I wore, the zipper repaired with fishing line after the trip, and when I fold it up on shelves, I can smell the desert inside the fabric. Dry sage, creosote, and something sharp that smells, I realized much later, like iron or old coins. People ask if what I saw was real. I want to tell you the truth plainly, the way a man lays out a map for strangers who might drive the same road. We'd planned the trip like most guys do. Quick messages, midnight jokes, a Saturday morning meetup at a gas station, 2 tents, too much jerky, and an idea that the desert would be a strip of silence where you can escape everything that hums and pings in the city. Our destination was Red Mesa Basin, a heat-scarred bowl of juniper and sandstone tucked off a narrow county road that everyone in our group called the Forgotten Lane. None of us were experienced backpackers. We were a mutt pack, mechanics, a teacher, a bartender, people whose Sunday hours off rarely matched, so when they did, we shoved our lives into canvas and nylon and called it adventure. I want you to meet them because they were part of why it all felt so ordinary until it stopped being ordinary. There was Jonah Brooks, tall, quick to laugh, kept an old pocket knife he called insurance. Travis Lane, a calm, older cousin of everyone with a steady hand and a bright headlamp he swore by. Maya Sinclair, a wrangler at a dude ranch, tougher than the rest of us, who could start a fire with a match and a grudge. And Riley Shaw, who drove the truck, a quiet person with a leather-bound journal they claimed was full of sketches of road signs and lightning strikes. All ordinary, all human. No myths, no hunters of beasts, just friends who liked a campfire and the wide sky. We left Phoenix at dawn, the city trailing us with its last lightless office towers. The drive to Red Mesa Basin takes less than 3 hours on paper, but time stretches when you turn off the highway and the radio starts chewing dust. The road narrowed into washboard and then into a ribbon of 2-wheel tracks. Cacti leaned away from the heat like people at a bad joke. As we neared the basin, the land folded into shadows and ridges. The sun hit the stones and turned them into copper coins glinting at the horizon. We picked a flat place near a dry wash, a patch of land with a perfect view of the ridgeline and the sky like an empty theater. That first evening was the kind of warmth and laughter you hope for when you go away. A cheap whiskey passed around, a guitar that could barely keep 2 chords together, the stars doing their loudest work overhead. We ate too much, joked in the way men do to keep a silence from getting too deep, traded stories that smelled of bravado and half-remembered lore. Someone, I think it was Jonah, told of the old miners who used to haunt the hills, of lost shafts and claims, of men who stashed coins in false bottoms and never came back for them. We laughed it off as campfire embellishment. When you'd been to enough campsites, you learned the rules. Make light of the dark, don't stare too long at horizons, keep your boots by your tent flap. We set our tents with the practicality of people who had done worse things than pitch canvas. Maya's fire came up like a miracle, and we circled it, the flames throwing faces into relief like actors on a stage. We left food in the truck and nothing tempting in the tents, a mutual respect for raccoons, coyotes, and the obvious hunger of desert creatures. Our headlamps were charged. Travis had a hand radio, low battery but functioning. No one expected anything more than a night full of ordinary noises. Coyotes, wind through the juniper, the occasional truck on a distant county road. You expect, when you tell a story like this, to say the first strange thing was a howl, or a pair of yellow eyes, or a footstep near the tent. But the first oddity was small and domestic, the sound of a can rolling. About an hour after we put the fire to ashes, Riley swore they heard metal on pebble. We laughed, then listened. The basin answered with a soft, indifferent chorus. A can rolled again, slow, deliberate, like someone testing the rules. We went quiet. The sound didn't come from the wash near our truck. It came from farther along the rim, a place where the land folded into a darker lip of shadow and tumbled stone. Jonah, always the one for proofs, grabbed his flashlight and wandered toward the sound. He called back, joking, and when he didn't return for longer than the joke should have allowed, the laughter evaporated. I know what it feels like to move from chuckling to alert thinking. The human brain hates a gap. It fills it with the nearest thing it knows. So we did what men who pay attention to small noises do. We got our jackets, our shoes, and our flashlights. The beam of Travis's headlamp caught something on the ridge before we did, a scrape of light on metal. At first, I thought it was a can, ordinary as trash. Then I saw the shape, a small, dented tin can with a length of rag tied to it like a crude handle. It rested on a rock, as if someone had set it out and left it like an offering. We argued quietly about whether someone was playing a prank. It would have been a cruel one to drive all the way out, leave a can, and vanish. Maya muttered about kids or hunters who wanted to spook campers. Riley said they could check the tracks. We followed a line of partial prints into the scrub, into the broken lip of the basin. The prints were odd, boot impressions that wavered between clarity and nothing, as if the ground couldn't decide whether it wanted to keep the memory of weight. There were more things, too. Broken twigs arranged like tally marks, the glint of something in the brush that could have been a coin but was just as likely a quartz shard. By the time we reached the place where the ridge stared out over the basin, the moon was a slice and the sky a dark bowl. The can was not alone. Around it, on the rocks, were other small, deliberate offerings. An old key, a tarnished button, a child's marble. They were laid out like stones on a grave. No footprints led away from them in a convincing trail. It was as if something had placed them there and then evaporated back into the night. That was the last of the ordinary explanations. Up to then, we had plausible deniability, kids, hunters, pranksters. From that point forward, we only had the story of what came after. The thing the basin kept for itself and the way it taught us not to be comfortable in a world that looks like ours. Main story begins now. The air on the ridge changed. The wind stopped holding its breath. It became a watcher. We heard over the rocks a soft scraping, like cloth over stone, and then a whisper that might have been a name. Jonah, who had stepped closer to the offerings, reached out and his hand trembled as if from cold, though the night was warm. He picked up the tarnished button and his face folded, then went white in a way that didn't need moonlight to show. Before any of us could speak, something answered from the basin. A sound that was not a coyote, not a human, not any animal we knew. It was a long, patient inhalation and then a voice, or the memory of one, that called, in a voice made of gravel and distance, Evan. When your name is called in the dark in a voice you know, you don't move in time, you move in memory. I am not proud of what I did next. I shouted back, rationality as my coat. Who's out there? The voice repeated my name, softer, like something learning how to say it properly. Jonah stepped closer to the lip, and for a blink I saw, or thought I saw, a pale smear of something shifting in the rocks, like a blanket being pulled free. Maya reached for Jonah's sleeve. Travis shone a light, and for a heartbeat we saw eyes too close together, reflecting the beam like coins. Then there was silence, an absence that felt heavier than a shout. We ran back to camp. We packed the truck in a jittery, clumsy panic. Riley started the engine like a prayer. As we left Red Mesa Basin, the headlights showed nothing in the wash and everything in the sky, but the mirror gave us one more thing. Stacked on the ridge like a set of quiet teeth were the offerings, the can, the key, the marble, arranged in a line that matched the impression of our last campfire. When I looked at Jonah, he was shaking, but shaking in a way that belonged to relief that we were leaving. But his hands were stained with something brown that hadn't been there before. He said nothing. He never could tell us how that mark got on his jacket, or why the hair on his neck stood up for weeks afterward. People ask me now why we didn't call the police. It was a stupid, cowardly, practical reason. How do you explain a voice in the dark that said your name and left gifts on rocks? How do you report offerings and expect disbelief to be paid in anything but pity? We drove to the next town, sat in a diner, and drank coffee until the lines under our eyes smoothed into something like composure. We told each other the story in fragments, the way a broken picture can be assembled into a face if everyone contributes a piece. Months later, when the chill of that night came and went with unexpected triggers, a tin can on the curb, the sound of wind through a vent, I tried to pin down what had happened. I kept returning to the ridge, to the line of little things on the rock. If it was a prank, it was the kind that collects at the edges of human cruelty and leaves a taste in the mouth like metal. If it was something else, it had taught us an elementary, terrible thing, that names can be tools, and the desert keeps an economy of favors and debts measured in small, shining objects. I have not been back to Red Mesa Basin since. I do not plan to. I do not know what Jonah left on that ridge, or why he came back with a brown smear and a secret about how the air had whispered my name. I do know one thing. The desert is patient, and once you hear it speak, it watches to see if you will answer. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. After we left Red Mesa Basin, the world reassembled itself into ordinary shapes. Gas stations, a diner with a neon coffee cup, the kind of highway that forgets the sky for a while. We tried to make normal of it. We told the story in half laughs at the Three Forks diner, like men who needed the sound of clatter and coffee to prove reality. Some weirdo left us a bunch of junk on a rock, Jonah said, his voice the exact timbre of someone trying to sell a lie. We all wanted that lie. We wanted the explanation that fit the pattern of our lives. The problem was the way Jonah's hands shook, the brown smear on his jacket, and the way he kept looking in mirrors. Back in Phoenix, life sluiced around us. Work grinds, text threads that never quite closed, the small betrayals of schedules. Jonah tried to be the same tall, quick-to-laugh guy who liked to show off his pocket knife, but he began to keep odd hours. He showed up late to our Monday night poker game with pockets full of dirt and tiny stones he insisted were nothing. He rinsed them under the sink and kept one in his truck under the driver's seat in a small tin. He wouldn't say why. When I pressed him once, he offered up a grin that didn't reach his eyes and changed the subject. Maya went back to the ranch and wrote with a sharper edge in group messages about rusted gates and wild horses. Riley, who had the journal, remember, kept quiet in that quiet, became cagey. They started skipping our calls with flimsy excuses about overtime and projects. Travis, the practical one with the hand radio and level head, tried to make sense of it scientifically. He took a weekend and drove us back toward Red Mesa Basin with the idea of shining more light on the ridge, looking for footprints, evidence, or someone with a taste for pranks. We expected, foolishly, to set the record straight. We went back in daylight. The basin looked like any other slice of scrubland. Sun-brazed stones, a few lizards skittering, a horizon that might as well have been a photograph. The ridge where the offerings had been was a line of weathered rocks. We searched. There were no fresh footprints. There were no cans arranged like offerings. There were, however, and this was the part that made my stomach do something my mouth could not. Small depressions in the soil where little objects could have rested. Human hands left overnight. The dent of a button, the imprint of a marble, a coin-sized ring. We found one of the items Jonah had touched, a tiny brass button, half buried, with a strange kind of patina on it. Travis bagged it. We joked to each other like men juggling fear into a circus. Weird, huh? We also felt watched. After that visit, the edges of our lives frayed. Jonah had nightmares that left him breathless and angry. He stopped hanging out at the bar where we used to drink. He'd sit in his truck when we called him and say he needed to be alone. Once I drove by his place and saw the backyard lit with little things laid on the barbecue. A spoon, a tarnished key, a blue marble, arranged in a cross. He was standing at the door, and when our eyes met, he lifted his hands like someone admitting defeat. Riley's journal started to make less sense the more I read it. It wasn't just sketches of road signs and lightning strikes anymore. There were pages of the basin, marks of rocks and little circles with lines that looked like coordinates. In the margins were words written in a kind of shorthand that mostly spelled out observations. Pattern, gifts, returns. And once, more chillingly, it likes names. I tried to get Riley to talk. They closed the journal and said, "Some things you don't write down if you plan to keep them." That was when silence became another kind of sound between us. We each sought answers in the ways we were inclined. Maya started digging into local lore, calling old-timers at the ranch, and combing the county library for mentions of the basin. She found a sliver of something, an old mining claim from the 1930s with a surname I didn't recognize and a note about items left for the well on it. Not much, but enough to stitch a new unease. Travis, using his logical mind, took the brass button and had it tested casually. A friend who worked at a museum said the metalwork suggested it could have been early 20th century and probably from an old uniform. That answer did nothing to make the creeping feel small. The little disruptions multiplied. My mailbox got a can placed on its post one morning, dented and empty, its rag handle tied in a knot, just like the one on the ridge. My sister's cat came home wearing a coin tied to its collar. Jonah's truck was found one night parked facing the desert with the engine off and 3 of his tires flattened from the inside, nothing punctured, just sagged like they had lost the idea of being round. Small objects kept turning up in the strangest places, under a waitress's coffee cup, inside a library book I'd checked out years ago, in the pocket of a coat that hadn't been worn in months. Each time, the items were arranged like offerings, deliberate and oddly intimate. People told us to go to the police. We tried once. The woman at the precinct with the tired eyes smiled politely and asked us if we were sure the items were not an art project or kids' pranks. She wrote it down with the kind of respect reserved for the eccentric. Her report went into a file that would never be opened. You could feel the bureaucracy closing like a door because the world prefers things with paperwork and refused to believe in the granular, persistent creep of a name called from the dark. Jonah stopped answering his phone for long stretches. The last time I saw him before things got worse, he invited me over and poured whiskey like there was an apology in it. He told me, in halting fragments, that sometimes at night he felt the basin watching him the way a trap watches a mouse, patient, inevitable. He swore he had gone to the ridge again alone and found the neatest arrangement of objects, not just one button now, but dozens, tiny treasures that did not belong to any human hand around town. He said he picked up one of the objects, a small carved pawn of dark wood, and the world went thin. He swore he heard my name from somewhere like a throat clearing in another room. "Why me?" I asked. "Why call my name?" He laughed, a sound close to tears. "Names are promises, Evan. Maybe it wanted to make a market." That was when the main thing, the thing we could not ignore, moved from being odd to urgent. The gifts that had been isolated and weird were not anomalies anymore. They were following. People I didn't know started showing up at our bars, asking our names with too much interest. My phone would ring, and on the other end would be a silence, like someone testing the boundary of being. Once, in the middle of a Tuesday, I arrived at my mailbox and found, taped to the lid, one of Riley's sketches from their journal. A crude map of the basin with a small X at the ridge. It had not been mailed to me. It had been left, as if by hand, in the space I considered my least public. There's nothing heroic about the next thing. No lightning bolt or moment of clarity. It was simply a night when Jonah didn't come home. His apartment was normal, dishes in the sink, his jacket hung. On his bedside table lay the small tin he had begun to carry since the basin, filled with buttons, keys, a marble, and a folded scrap of paper with my name on it in a handwriting that wobbed between his and mine. On his bathroom mirror, written backward in soap, were the words, "Keep talking. It listens." I called the others. We met at the diner again and spoke in low voices. Riley closed the journal and said nothing for a long time. Maya's face was raw with the kind of panic that shaves off reason. Travis hit the table with his palm and said, "We go back. We take everything. We bring light." We were a mess, appointed to do sensible things. Pack, prepare, buy batteries and rope and food. I told myself the trip would be for answers, for a confrontation with the basin that would be neat and final. The night before we left, I dreamed of the ridge, a line of small things like teeth. Something whispered my name and I woke knowing we were already too late. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. We drove back out to Red Mesa Basin before dawn, the truck full of things that made the whole thing feel official. Batteries, headlamps, a cheap video camera, Riley swore would catch anything that wasn't human: rope, a shovel, and a thick coil of skepticism rolled up like a spare tire in all of us. Travis had wired a CB radio to the truck battery and tested it like a ritual. Maya brought a hunting knife and a roll of bright tape she said would show prints better. Riley tucked the journal under their jacket like a fragile relic. Jonah's tin sat on the dash, clinking occasionally as if to remind us we'd pledged something by coming. There was an odd courage in daylight. The ridge looked less like a stage and more like old geography, a line of sun-baked rock and scrub that could be cataloged and measured and, if necessary, mocked. We parked where the truck's tires dug familiar scoops and carried our things up the slope. The basin smelled of heat and dust and the faint, sour tang of old copper. For a while, we walked like men returning to a campsite, trading jokes about how we'd bring a casserole next time or set up a tiki torch. It was a flimsy mask. We split into two groups. Riley and I took the ridge line, methodical, scanning for the smallest hints of disturbance. Travis and Maya would sweep lower, watching for tracks or places where someone could have passed unnoticed. We agreed on check-ins and times because even if you think the world will hold together by daylight, there's comfort in rote safety. At first, the ridge was empty, just the weathered bones of the desert. Then, 300 yards in, we reached the place where the items had first been laid out. The offerings were back. Not all of them, but enough to make breathing harder. A tin can, a small iron key, a single child's marble, and a coin that looked older than anything I owned. They were not scattered. They were arranged with a care that felt criminally intimate, like someone had been keeping a ledger. Each object lay in its own tiny, shallow depression, neatly pressed into the earth. Riley crouched and ran a finger around the marble's rim. On the camera they'd brought, the lens fogged faintly as if breathing on it. "They're repeating," Riley said. "It's a pattern." Their voice had that low, even cadence it used when sketching out new pages in the journal. I wanted to believe this was a trick, a local art student's macabre installation. But then Riley held up a page from their journal, a sketch of the very arrangement, done weeks earlier, with the same spacing and the same number of offerings. The journal's ink was older than the items. The map had been drawn before we ever visited. That's when the skin on my forearms pulled tight. Travis's voice came crackling through the radio, sudden and close. "Evan, we found prints. Big ones, like boots, but weird." Maya added something that made us all go quiet. "There's a wash down below where the rocks have been turned over, like someone's been moving things, and there are marks like tally scratches." The radio went dead. Static ate the rest. We moved slower after that, as if speed might jar something fragile into motion. The ground where the offerings sat had impressions leading not away but toward the next shelf of rock, forming a line that curved like a question mark. The line of objects ended at a shallow depression in a slab, and there, tucked into a crack, was a note wrapped in oilcloth. It was not the sort of thing a prankster leaves, too careful, too preserved. Riley unwrapped it with ceremony and unfolded a square of brittle paper. The handwriting on it was neat in a way that made my throat close. It was my name, written not by Jonah or Riley or myself, but in a hand that tilted and looped like a stranger's attempt at familiarity. Beneath it, a single sentence: "Keep your end. Keep hearing." I felt something like heat rise and leave me in a cold circle. Jonah's tin thudded against the dash in my memory. Names as currency. Names as contracts. We joked in the diner about the thing wanting names, and now someone or something had made it precise. We climbed lower into the wash where Travis and Maya were. The wash was a narrow throat between rocks, and at the bottom, the earth had been disturbed like a bed someone had left in a hurry. There were more items: a child's ribbon, a small silver spoon, a single button with a faded emblem similar to the brass button we'd found before. The smell here was stronger. Copper and wet earth, and something metallic that reminded me of pennies left too long in a jar. Travis was pale. He tussed his hair and pointed at the edge of the wash where the rock cleft into a small cave mouth. "Something's in there," he said. He had that look of a mechanic who hears a knock in an engine and knows exactly how bad the damage could be, even if he hasn't seen it. Maya slung a rope and we eased into the cave like men who had chosen to go into a dark room at the back of the house. It was shallow, only a few feet in, and at the bottom was the tiniest altar you could imagine. A shallow bowl carved of stone, and arranged around it dozens of small items: buttons, teeth of animals, a sliver of mirror, a child's bead. Along the rock wall, someone had scratched words in a hand that shifted between neat and frantic. Names. Debt. Return. Riley swallowed and whispered, "It's been here a long time. People have been coming." The word came out like a confession. Trading. Travis tried to take a sample of the scratches with his knife, but his blade caught on something and he cursed. When he brushed his fingers along the etched letters, a whisper brushed my ear as if the rock itself had spoken. Evan. My head snapped, and for one breath I saw a movement at the cave's mouth. A smear of color like someone stepping backward. I thought it was Jonah at first, but there was no one there. We left the cave and the offerings where they lay. We could have carried them off and burned them, with prayers or rituals to rid ourselves of whatever ledger had been kept. Instead, perhaps because we were stupid or moral or superstitious in different ways, we photographed everything and took only a single item: the spoon. It felt sacrilegious to disturb the altar, but Riley wrapped the spoon in cloth and tucked it into their jacket. Riley muttered about the journal needing a sample. On the walk back up the ridge, the light changed. A thin, high wind came through and tugged at our shirts like warning fingers. Travis kept looking over his shoulder as if expecting someone to follow us, or to be missing. Here's the part of it that burns when I replay the day. Somewhere on the ridge, something that sounds like a voice. Not mine, not Travis's, maybe not even human, called my name twice. Not a shout, but the kind of call that fits into the hollow of a man's memory. I froze. Riley froze. Everything small in the desert seemed to still itself to listen. We made it back to the truck without incident. We drove out without looking. Jonah's apartment was waiting like a blank page. He was still missing. That night, Jonah's tin was found in the truck bed, open and empty. Inside our truck, someone had arranged 3 things on the bench seat: a small carved pawn we recognized from his collection, a marble we'd seen on the ridge, and a scrap of paper with a single line in a hand that trembled slightly. Pay up. We sat in an empty diner again, fluorescent light humming overhead, hands around coffee that had gone cold. None of us had an answer for what pay up meant. Riley closed the journal and, for the first time, looked as afraid as I felt. "It collects," they said quietly. "It collects, and it keeps tabs." Maya wiped her eyes on the heel of her hand and said, "Maybe it's about more than names. Maybe it wants to be repaid." And there it hung. The old, terrible ledger. We had owed something without knowing what, and now the bookkeeper was calling in favors. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. We drove back to the basin that last time like a funeral procession that expected the corpse to still sit up and speak. Jonah's tin sat between us on the dash, heavier than it had any right to be, and Riley's journal was open to a page where they'd drawn the little altar again and again until the lines wore thin. We knew what we were walking into, or thought we did, and that knowledge felt thin as tissue against whatever kept the ridge tidy and patient. We split like surgeons and moved slowly. Twilight fell like a curtain, and the basin became a bowl of polished shadows. The offerings were already there, neat and waiting. Buttons, a spoon, a marble, a child's bead, a coin. Someone, something, had put them out before we arrived. There was a smell of iron and old rain. In the cave mouth, the little altar glittered with dozens of objects we hadn't seen before. Names, debts, returns. The words were scratched into the stone like a ledger. The letter strokes were crisp and old. Riley had a plan that was mostly hope. Maya and Travis would circle high to keep watch. Riley would record everything with the camera. I would go in and try to speak to whatever kept the basin's books. It was a bad plan dressed up in the clothes of action, which is what frightened people do when they think they can bargain with the unknown. Inside the cave, the air was still. The scratched words seemed to tremble. I set Jonah's tin on the rock altar and opened it. Inside, a few buttons, a rusted nail, a scrap of paper with my name on it in a handwriting that wasn't mine and wasn't Jonah's either. The paper felt thicker than paper should. When I picked it up, the cave went quiet, like someone holding their breath. Something answered, and it didn't look like anything I'd seen before. It was a presence that lived in the space between my words, a pressure that leaned in. The offerings on the stone seemed to lean toward us, as if pulled by attention. A voice slid across the rock. It wasn't a voice so much as the outline of one, formed by moving dust. You brought the ledger, it said, and my name came after, spoken with the casual interest of a shopkeeper tallying a debt. I thought then of Jonah, frantic, hollow-eyed when we last saw him, and of the tin he'd carried like a coin bank for a habit he wouldn't explain. I thought of how names had been called like tabs. What do you want? I asked, and the cave answered with an old civil tone. Names, promises, returns, keep your end. Riley, who had been filming, whispered into the camera, we can't give it money. It trades in names. It keeps accounts. Their voice shook. Maya, who had lived with horses and midnight storms, said, there must be a way to bargain. Maybe it doesn't need a life. Maybe it wants a story, a confession, something honest. All of those felt pathetic and petty beside the ancient economy that had been keeping small, obedient ledgers. Then the terms were made clear. The presence, if it could be said to have made a face, offered this. Jonah would be returned if one of us placed a name on the altar and relinquished it. Not destroyed, but given. The name would no longer be remembered by other people. The person who paid would be the only one to carry that name's absence, and the cost might reach further than memory. No guarantees, only trade. Travis swore and said, no, we won't. Maya's hand settled on his arm. She was as afraid as anyone, but also the kind of person who measures risk in horses and not in ghosts. Riley almost volunteered, but the journal shook in their hands and they said, I can't. It writes back for me when it wants to. Jonah's tin rattled like an impatient coin bank. I can't tell you why I volunteered. Maybe it was the sight of Jonah's name on that scrap of paper, or the hollow of his apartment waiting for him, or some small cowardly calculation that said one man could do what a legion could not. Maybe it was the thing men do when they choose to prove they are useful. I stepped forward and felt ridiculous and noble at the same time. They handed me a strip of oilcloth. Riley opened their journal and traced a line where an old man's handwriting had written my name in the margin weeks before, as if they'd seen it there already. I wrote my name again in black ink, and Jonah's tin chimed like an altar bell. I folded the oilcloth, and Maya put her hand on my shoulder. If you go, promise you'll say nothing, she said. Promise you'll do it when it's time. I nodded, because I was a fool who believed in gestures. At the altar, I spoke my name aloud, each syllable like a coin on a scale. The cave listened. The presence answered by touching the paper with a whisper of wind that smelled like pennies and hay. For a moment, I thought it would hurt. It didn't. It took something I didn't know I had and left a cold, slick nothing behind. The world tilted like an old table. Jonah's tin shook, then curled into my hand, and there he was, stumbling into the mouth of the cave, eyes blank, breath sharp, alive. We gathered him like a miracle and pulled him to the truck. He mumbled and coughed and did not remember the basin, the ridge, the offerings. But he was there. We drove away with the dawn cracking open like a cheap egg. I thought we were saved. That night, over bad diner coffee, Jonah told us he had been on a long walk and woke up in a field. His voice was the voice of a man who'd had a bad dream. He hugged us, said thanks, and the world warmed a little. The next morning, my phone had no missed calls. I'd sent messages that had not been replied to. An old friend I called asked, politely, "Do I know you?" My bank account was in my name still, but a cousin I rang off the cuff asked me, "Who are you trying to reach?" I drove to my sister's house, and when she opened the door, she looked at me like a neighbor. Her smile was kind but blank. Photos and frames had me in them, but when I showed them a picture of me with Jonah at the ridge, she tilted her head and said, "That man looks familiar. I'm sorry, Evan. Do I know him?" It was a slow, unraveling horror. People knew my face. They'd taken pictures with me. They'd shaken my hand at work, but their mouths didn't hold the sound of my name anymore. They didn't have stories with me in them. Friends called me by descriptions. The man who used to drink coffee at the bar. The guy who fixed my truck. They could not, would not, bring my name to their lips. It was as if my thread through their lives had been cut and tucked away in a ledger no one else could see. Jonah remembered the face, but not the nights. Maya hugged me, and then forgot the hug minutes later and apologized for their hands trembling. Riley closed their journal for the first time in months and wrote nothing for days. Travis threw the CB radio in the back of his truck and didn't touch it. The basin had kept its end. Jonah returned. I had kept mine, a name relinquished. But the price was subtler and crueler than we'd been able to imagine. People could see me, but they couldn't name me. Letters arrived addressed to the man in the photo. My voicemail was a silence filled with greetings that never used my name. I tried to tell the police again, but when I said my name to the dispatcher, she typed and then asked, "And what's your name, sir?" I told her. She paused and said, "Is that what you go by?" As if it were a handle and not an identity. I started writing everything down into a notebook, names, numbers, dates. I wrote that first page the night before we went back. It's why I can tell you this now. I wrote it down where something might find it, even if voices forgot me. So if you ever go to a quiet basin and find a line of little offerings, know this. It keeps books, and it knows how to tally. It will take payment. It understands ledgers older than our towns. It will trade for its coin, a name, a promise, a debt, settled beneath a sky that doesn't speak to us. Jonah's back to work, laughing in a way that sounds practiced. Riley's drawings are quieter. Maya goes out earlier each morning and doesn't come home until late. Travis sold his CB radio. And me? I still answer when someone calls me by the few words that stick. A nickname that doesn't count, a grunt that means friend. But fewer and fewer people remember that I ever exist as Evan Price, dated and anchored on a night in October 2019. I write this because when I lay that oilcloth down, I thought I was saving friends. I did. But I gave something away too. And the worst part is not being gone. It's realizing that being unremembered means your life becomes a series of photographs and receipts that no one can tie to a voice. So I write. I fold my handwriting into pages and hide them in pockets and under floorboards. Maybe this is selfish, maybe it's human. If you find this and you can say my name aloud, do it. Say it like a prayer or a curse. The ledger will be listening, always tallying, always patient. Names are its currency. Don't spend yours lightly. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. This story is over. Get ready for the next one. My name is Ethan Brooks. I'm 32 years old, and this happened on June 14, 2019. People think of Arizona as red rock and postcard sunsets, but they rarely talk about the hollow silence that lives between the saguaros after dark. I didn't either until that week. I was supposed to be on a simple weekend, 2 nights, a couple of friends, a cooler full of beer and burgers, a trail that promised good stars and easy hiking. Instead, it became the kind of memory that sits heavy in your chest when you try to sleep. Why I went is the easiest part of this tale. I needed to get away. I had been grinding at a tech job in Phoenix for almost 6 years, the kind of job that paid well and left you hollow. Logan Price, my oldest friend from high school, tattooed and stubborn, sent the group text, "Juniper Hollow this weekend? Clear skies. No cell, no real life." He used the phrase like it was a promise. Logan's a planner in his own chaotic way. He mapped the route, picked the campsite, and convinced 2 others to come along. Sierra Blake, a nurse who could calm a room with a single glance, and Marco Ruiz, an outdoorsy contractor who owned 10 flannels and a very loud laugh. I would be the sitter of the cooler and the guy who'd record the dumb parts on his phone. We all laughed about it. We all meant it. Juniper Hollow wasn't on many maps. Logan said it was a backcountry pull just off a lesser dirt road, tucked into a wash between Coyote Ridge and a plateau locals called Saguaro Basin. He'd been there once years earlier with a girlfriend. He swore to the memory of a perfect night sky and a quiet breeze that tasted like mesquite. He also swore there were abandoned miner huts nearby from a century ago, which honestly won Sierra's curiosity and Marco's imagination. I like the sound of miner huts. Real places hold more honesty than Instagram spots. Before we left, there was the usual choreography of prep. Logan printed a GPS track on paper, archaic and comforting because he likes redundancy. He double-checked the spare gas can and the truck's battery. Marco packed a hand-stitched leather journal, a Swiss Army knife that had saved his hand once, and a half-broken headlamp he swore still worked. Sierra, practical as ever, packed a first aid kit with enough bandages to cover a small army and a thermos that promised coffee at dawn. I brought my camera, a notepad, and a small voice recorder I used for personal notes. We all brought a little hubris too. The kind that comes with being competent city people who think nature is a lovely weekend escape and not something that will read your face like a map. We took the freeway out of Phoenix, the city folding behind us into low desert and then into the high tones of the basin. The road thinned, then dissolved into a ribbed dirt track, and finally into a narrow lane where only one truck could pass at a time. The sky was ridiculous, an enormous blue dome. We stopped at a roadside market for ice and jerky. The woman who ran it, a small Hispanic woman with silver hair, watched us and asked where we were headed. Juniper Hollow, Logan said, proud. She made a face I couldn't parse, a mix of pity and warning, and asked the date. When Logan told her June 14, 2019, she crossed herself and said softly, "Mind the night wind." We laughed it off. We were young enough to assume cryptic warnings were just local color. That afternoon, before the sun smeared into cinnamon, we found the hollow. The pull-off was hardly a place, more a suggestion of flattened scrub and an old tire track leading between two low hills. We put down our chairs near a small stand of junipers that smelled like Christmas and camped with the truck in a crescent around the fire pit we'd cobbled from rocks. The miner huts Logan had boasted about were visible in the distance, crumbled, roofless shells like the bones of old houses, silhouetted against the golden light. A thin trail wandered toward them, and for reasons that should make no sense in the telling, the sight tightened something inside my chest. A little unease I chalked up to nerves. We introduced ourselves to the place. Marco climbed a stubby mesquite to hang a cooler and a rope for the coyotes, he explained. Logan unfolded an old map and pointed out where he'd camped before. Sierra arranged firewood and checked knot strength like a ritual. There were conversations about jobs, exes, and a pact to stop talking about work for the whole trip. We lit the fire, and the evening did what evenings do. It softened edges, made us braver in ways that laughter can summon. The stars came one by one, and someone, Marco probably, started telling the kind of slightly embellished camp tales that make the shadows feel thicker. It was perfect. It was normal. Before the main thing, the part you came for, the reason I'm telling you this, there were other details to notice. The desert sounds at dusk, a distant coyote's yip, insects like tiny motors, the whisper of a breeze through dry leaves. The miner huts seemed to drink the light. Their doorways were black hollows. Logan took a shot of whiskey and poured one for me. Sierra joked about a ghost miner she'd read about in a local paper online. Old man Kincaid who used to whistle at night, she said, laughing. Marco whistled the first bars of an old tune right then, and it echoed. I remember thinking how small that sound was against the openness. We talked about the practicalities too. Battery levels, where we'd set the car keys, who would take the first watch. We were a small committee of competence. Logan insisted on the night watch rotating hourly. He said it was just protocol in case someone wandered in looking for help. No one thought to ask what could possibly go wrong. No one thought to check the sky for odd cloud formations or to listen harder for the way the wind might carry sound in a hollow. As darkness settled, the miner huts became mere teeth in the landscape. We cooked burgers and argued about whether the Milky Way was visible. Sierra decisively won that argument and pointed it out. The fire became a circle of gold, and our faces were lit like marionettes when we told more stories to keep the night friendly. I turned the recorder on and left it on the table between us, a small red light blinking like an eye. If you want the literal truth, the recorder captured the laughter, the clink of glasses, Logan humming under his breath, and the soft rattle of the truck's cooling metal. The main story, the thing that broke the ordinary seam of the night, comes after this, after the polished routine of friends and campfire and safe jokes. It starts with a sound that none of our maps and plans had accounted for, and it unfolded so slowly at first we called it nothing. Then it became everything. It began just after midnight, when the fire had died to coals and the coyotes had gone quiet. I had volunteered for the first watch and sat with my back against the truck bed, pillows propped, eyes on the stars, and on the miner huts beyond, where the darkness seemed to breathe. Logan snored softly in his sleeping bag, Sierra within earshot but dreaming, and Marco's breathing was a steady metronome. The desert around us had that loaded silence, like a held breath. Then, there it was, At first, I thought it was the old truck settling, or a branch rubbing, or a desert animal. A thin whistle threaded through the stillness. It wasn't like Marco's earlier tune. This whistle was long and low, and there was something human in its cadence, as if someone were calling in a language meant only for the night. I stood up, the recorder heavy in my pocket, and walked toward the sound, because people always walk toward strange things in stories and in truth, because curiosity is a more dangerous animal than fear. I crossed the small wash and the whistle stopped. The air felt colder near the miner huts, and in that exact second I understood why the woman at the market had made the face she had. Something about the hollow kept its own hours. The story is just beginning. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. I walked back to the truck with my shoes crunching soft, dry soil, telling myself out loud that it was nothing, an animal, some old wind through the hollows of the miner huts. The whistling had stopped when I moved. The night tasted metallic. My chest was an animal pacing its cage. I didn't wake anyone. I shouldn't have woken anyone. That was rational thought, the kind that lives in the light. In the dark, rational thought sounds like a dare. I sat with the truck for another hour, smoking Marco's spare cigarette even though I don't smoke, listening to the bones of the desert settle. The recorder was in my back pocket. I kept feeling it there like a small, patient heart. At some point, I dozed, and when I woke, everything had the soft, obscene clarity that nightmares borrow from daylight. Logan was awake. He'd unzipped his bag and was staring at the ruins, a cigarette burned down to his thumb. Sierra was sitting cross-legged by the coals, rubbing her arms even though it wasn't that cold. Marco wasn't there. It should have been simple. Marco had taken a piss, walked to the outskirts of camp, tripped over a root, and wandered in the dark. But there are rules to how things are missing. A friend doesn't simply evaporate between the truck and the trees without some sign. There was no sign. No crunching of footsteps leading outward. No headlamp beam reflecting on a rock. Nothing. Just the absence of Marco, like somebody had mistaken him for a coat and hung him on a nail. We called his name until our throats went dry. Sierra's voice stayed steady for a while because she was trained to stay steady. Eventually, her hands shook like they'd been running for hours. Logan wanted to split up to check the miner huts, the wash, the plateau. I argued to stay together, that if you separate, you make it easier for the problem to pick you off. Logan looked at me with the kind of tired skepticism that comes when someone thinks you are being dramatic. He said, "He wouldn't go far. He knows the rules." The rules were the little list we'd made earlier. Stay near the truck, check in every 15 minutes on watch, don't wander off after dark. Sierra crouched by the coals and pulled a bandage from her medical kit, braiding it into her hair as if the repetition could anchor her. "He's not in any of the huts," she said after she'd already checked. No footprints leading out, nothing disturbed. She kept using the word nothing like it was a held thing, like nothing was pregnant with something. We decided to search in pairs with headlamps and the truck's high beams as backup. I took Logan. Sierra took the narrow trail toward the broken mill on the east side. We scanned with the harsh, clinical light that felt disrespectful in the wide night, like forcing a hospital lamp into a cathedral. The miner huts were cold in the beam. Inside one, I saw an old miner's hat on a plank, and beneath it, a pile of bone-dry newspapers that folded themselves into the dark. Someone had left a cigarette butt in the ash, a recent stub, still faint with smoke. My stomach flipped. Who else had been here? How long had they been here? The hut smelled of dust and old metal, and something else I couldn't name. On the walk back to camp, Logan went silent. He kept looking at the rocks, his jaw clenched. "You ever feel like you're being watched?" he said finally. "And it isn't animals?" He wasn't looking at anything specific, but it was the kind of question that opens a door. I told him about the whistle, the way it stopped when I moved. He let out a sound that could have been a laugh or could have been a scoff. "Must have been some old drunk," he said, but his voice didn't have conviction. We rejoined Sierra by the truck. She had a small plastic bag in her hand. She'd been walking the perimeter and found something half buried near the wash. A child's boot, caked in red dust. Small, not ours, not Marco's. It was a weird thing to find in Juniper Hollow. It was as if a puzzle had been dropped into our laps. She turned it over, and there was a smudge inside that looked suspiciously like soot, as if the thing had been close to a fire. We all stared at that boot like it had the answers folded into its seams. That's when the whispering began. At first, it was a softness at the edge of hearing, a hiss that could have been the wind doing something strange in the junipers. Then it grew into syllables, lilting and tangled, not English. It came from the direction of the ruined mill, a long, wet rasp that made my teeth ache. We all froze. Logan's face went paper white. Sierra's hand found mine, a quick grip like a life preserver. "Back to the truck," I said, though the sentence felt small. We moved as a single organism, bodies close, lights sweeping the dark. The whispering eked along the ridge, and with each pass I thought I could make a rhythm, like someone counting or calling a roll in an old language. When we reached the circle of coals, something else was wrong. The gas can Logan had tucked near the tailgate was overturned, the pinched cap missing, and there were long, deliberate scratches along the truck bed, drag marks. Marco's flannel jacket was halfway out of the bed, snagged like something had tried to take it. My mouth filled with a metallic taste. Logan grabbed the flashlight and flung its beam toward the miner huts. For a second, the light hit a figure standing between the ruins, tall, thin, hunched like a scarecrow. It held something that glinted in the beam, and then it was gone, melting against the broken walls. We all saw it. None of us moved. The coals dimmed to a single miserable red, like an eye closing on exhaustion. Sierra, usually the calmest, started to cry in small, controlled breaths. "We should call someone," she whispered, but of course we had no cell signal. The battery on my phone was down to 12%. The truck's radio cracked once, and then gave us nothing. The hollow felt like an instrument tuned to silence. Our map said Juniper Hollow was remote. It didn't say it was private property of whatever lurked here. That night, we didn't sleep. We nailed the truck's tailgate shut with old tent stakes, and we took turns keeping the coals alive. We kept the recorder running in case it caught something. We debated, wildly, sometimes bitterly, about what to do at first light. Logan wanted to go after Marco alone. I threatened to punch him if he did. Sierra suggested we wait and keep watch together. In the hollow, patience is an illusion you can't afford. About 3 a.m, the whistle came back, but it wasn't the same. It had a higher timbre, like a child's toy being tuned, and it was accompanied by a wet, slapping sound as if something big had been moving through the scrub. It started near the mill and moved in a slow arc, as if tracing the positions of our camp. The sound sliced at the edges of us and then stopped right outside the circle of light we'd made with the truck and coals, as if something had decided to draw a line and not cross it. That was the worst part. The sense that the night had rules, and that we, for the time being, were on the other side of them. We listened until the first gray of dawn, and in that dim light, the hollow looked different, less like a theater for fear, and more like a thing that had been patiently watching us, because watching was how it survived. Marco didn't come back by dawn. There were prints, but they ended abruptly near a juniper, as if someone had been picked up and carried away. We did the only thing people do when they're cornered by something they don't understand. We got organized. We moved toward the ruins together, the 4 of us a small, fragile convoy. The whispers followed us, and somewhere beneath them, the thing I couldn't place, was a kind of hunger that felt old as the ground. I don't know who made those scratches across the truck bed or why there was a child's boot near the wash. I do know that Juniper Hollow did not want us to go home yet. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. We moved toward the miner huts like men stepping into someone else's dream, the kind of dream that doesn't belong to you and doesn't want you there. The whispering slid ahead of us, a snake of sound that threaded through the broken doorways and pooled in the hollows of old window frames. Light from our headlamps skimmed flaking paint and twisted metal. It made the world look like a memory someone had tried to scrub clean. The closest hut still had a roof half sagged into its rafters. Inside, I found a child's drawing pinned beneath a rusted nail, a stick family, 4 heads all smiles, and beneath it, in a shaky hand, the name Kincaid. My throat tightened. Sierra knelt beside me and ran her fingers along the creased paper. The edges were burned in a way that suggested it had been close to a flame at some point, then saved. She looked up without saying anything, and in that look I felt a history close its fist. Logan lifted his beam and found footprints in the dust, bare, small, and not Marco's. They moved toward the wash and then turned, spattered in clumps where someone had disturbed the earth. "These are recent," Logan said, voice flat. The prints led to a shallow depression where the earth tasted like old smoke and wet iron. There, half buried beneath a tangle of roots, we found Marco's headlamp strap. The light itself had been smashed and dirt-filled. We dug with hands and pocket knives until the shovel in the truck, brought in case any of us had to dig out a truck stuck in sand, was pressed into service. Underneath, wrapped in a filthy flannel and smelling strongly of something acidic, we found a small journal. Marco's handwriting wasn't neat, but it was his. Scattered notes about the trail, a sketch of the miner huts, and at the back, a page with a single line that made my bones ache. They whisper at night. They ask for children. They call with wind. Sierra's fingers trembled as she read it. "Ask for children?" she echoed. "Marco, what the hell?" We had theories. Distressingly, each theory seemed worse than the last, old miners being squatters with dangerous superstitions, a disturbed loner who used Juniper Hollow for hunting, some natural predator dragging off people into caves. The last one seemed ridiculous, with no large predators near here, nothing big enough to carry a person off without leaving evidence. But Juniper Hollow had its own rules, and the usual rules didn't apply. As we moved between huts, the whispering gave us pauses to breathe, and then slapped us with a sound like wet fabric. There were signs that someone or something had been living here since before we arrived. Small circles of stones arranged not as foundations but like altars, charcoal smears on walls, and a scattering of small bones that, once you saw them, refused to be ordinary. The miner's ledger propped on a collapsed table had entries dated back to 1912. Names that had been crossed out and a single note repeated over and over, scrawled in a different hand in darker ink. "Mind the night wind." The ledger's last line was a smear of ink and a hand press in the paper, like someone had put their palm there and leaned too hard. We found more things that didn't fit together. Children's toys half buried in the dirt, a length of red ribbon snagged in a nail and pinned to a post with a bent nail, a photograph. It was old, sepia-toned, and showed a group of miners standing proud before a truck, faces stern and sun-leathered, and at the center, a man with hollowed eyes that seemed to bleed shadow in the cheap print. Someone had scratched a cross over that man's face, hard enough to rip the emulsion. "Kincaid," Sierra said. "That's the name Marco scribbled on the drawing." We kept finding footprints, some small, some large, some that stopped mid-stride like someone forgetting where they were going, and they spiraled outward from the huts as though the ground itself had an appetite. There was also the smell, an iron-rich tang that clung to the inside of our nostrils and wouldn't leave. It made my stomach churn in a way that no amount of breath or coffee seemed capable of fixing. By midday, we were exhausted in a way sleep couldn't fix. The desert sun was a merciless clock, and the hollowness of the place had worked its way into our muscles. We made a plan. Sierra and I would sweep the north side of the hollow while Logan rechecked the path and the truck for clues. If anyone found Marco, we would stay tight, call for sheriff help at the nearest ranger station, even if it meant driving an hour to get a signal. First, we found a cairn the size of a man's chest, stacked near a thorn bush. Under it, wrapped in what looked like a miner's rag, was a child's shoe, blackened and tiny, and a note carved into the wood of a post. "Leave them." The letters were all caps and carved deep. It wasn't a handwriting anyone there had. It felt older, like someone had used a heavy nail and a lot of patience. The wind hiccuped through the junipers and made the letters rattle like a mouth. We moved toward the wash, flashlights cutting through dust motes. That's when the sound started, different from the whispering, closer to a murmur like many voices folded inside a single breath. The murmur came from the ground, if the ground had lungs, and then it rose up and formed a cadence. It wasn't words we recognized. It was syllables that clicked at the edges as if cross-pollinated from several languages, and every round left a little frost on my scalp. Sierra stopped. She pointed, white-knuckled. At the base of an old mesquite where the earth had been recently turned, a handprint had been pressed into the dirt. Not a human handprint as I knew them, larger, with extra webbing like the toe of a glove, had been patted into mud. Next to it, faint, was a smear of dark red that still had the glisten of fresh metal. I swallowed and tasted my own fear, as tangy and bright as blood. "There's a shaft," Sierra whispered. She had found it before I did. A nearly concealed opening just a few feet wide, the mouth of something like a well, with rotten planks spanning the top and a rope that hung into the black, like a finger. The rope had tattoos, those crude loops that old miners used to tie around things, so it had been used by people who'd come before us. Marco's handwriting in the flannel matched the knots. Without talking, we pulled the rope free and peered into the dark. It smelled worse inside the shaft. Old metal, older smoke, and beneath them the faint sweetness of something that had stayed too long in the sun. We lowered the phone to send a light down. For a second, nothing happened, and then the beam hit something wet that reflected our light like the pupil of an eye. "Marco?" I called, my voice ridiculous in the hollow. The shaft swallowed it. There was a sound, half sob, half wind, and then a scratch, like fingers finding board and wood and urging themselves upward. For a moment, I thought Logan had come around a corner, but the sound then turned into a laugh that wasn't Marco's and shouldn't have been human. We didn't climb down. We couldn't. Something about the shaft told you that descent was a choosing you made only once. We dragged a plank down and pressed it over the opening like a lid, hammered in the corners with a rock until our hands ached. It felt like closing a mouth. We stood there with our breaths shallow and our heads full of the echo of that laughter. When we walked back toward the truck, we saw marks on the tailgate we'd missed earlier. New etchings in the metal carved with slow, patient nails. A tally of dates, one for each year going back decades, and beneath them, a small child's scrawl, "Come home." Logan's face when he met us at the truck was set into something dangerous. He had been looking into the ledger and saw the same names crossed out. "Kincaid?" he said again, but there was a hardness in his tone now. He wasn't a miner. He did things here. People said he could make the wind speak. He held up his hands as if catching himself. "That's nonsense. Superstition." But superstition is a kind of grammar, and Juniper Hollow was speaking in it. We were running out of words. Sierra wanted to leave then, to drive until asphalt and the hum of a different life smoothed our edges. Logan wanted to stay, to finish it, as if that was something you could do neatly, like folding a map. I wanted to find Marco. We were 4 people with 4 opinions and 1 remaining rope. The wind visited the hollow like an old, patient listener, and for the first time I understood the market woman's warning with an ache in the place behind my ribs. We decided to wait until dusk and then go back to the shaft with better gear. We wired a radio from the truck as a short-range lifeline. We buried Marco's headlamp near the cairn and placed the child's shoe on top, like an offering. Little things to say, we saw and we remember. Night was coming again. The hollowness settled in like a verdict. We drew a line around the camp and stood on it, watching the ruins like men waiting for a train they didn't want to board. The whispering started early this time, and it sounded almost like singing. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. We waited until dusk like people waiting for a sentence to be read aloud. Between the 3 of us, Logan, Sierra, and me, the decision to go back to the shaft felt less like bravery and more like the only way to keep from being eaten alive by the silence. The radio croaked occasionally with static that could have been a voice if you wanted it to be. We tied a new rope around my waist and looped it through Logan's belt. Sierra kept the truck light running, and her hand on a folded metal rod, she insisted, was for safety. We moved like a nervous animal pack, each step grinding old dust into the soles of our shoes. The mouth of the shaft looked like a black throat, its edges ragged with splinters and old rope. We lowered the light and let it fall, watching the beam cut into stacked darkness until it vanished. The air that rose from it smelled like old iron and something sweeter, rotted fruit, but older. It clung to the back of my throat and made me swallow. Logan lowered me in slow, controlled measures, while Sierra kept watch at the rim with the truck light painting the ground in a ring. The shaft wasn't deep at first, just a drop into a space that opened into a tunneled room and then another drop. The rope slid through my fingers like cold silk. The walls were slick with condensation and something darker that shone under our headlamp. As I reached the bottom and swung the light around, I understood why Marco had written, "They ask for children," in the back of the journal. There were small things here: doll eyes, a child's shoe patch, a row of tiny stones arranged like totems, and a dozen names carved on the wood support beams, many older than any of us, some fresh enough that the splinters still bit. I called up to them. "I've got light down here. It's like a pit house." Logan's voice came muffled through the rope. "Stay put. Sierra. Keep the truck on, if anything." She cut him off with a sharp, steady breath, and then we heard the faintest sound. Marco, coughing and laughing all at once, a sound that shouldn't belong to the same person. "Marco!" Logan's shout cracked the tunnel walls. The rope jerked, and I started up, hand numb with rope burn. When I broke the surface, Sierra was doubled over, weeping into her hands like she'd been holding her breath for months. Logan looked like he hadn't slept in years. We hauled Marco out together. He was alive. More miracle than matter. He was caked in dust, his beard tangled with spider webs and something sticky. His pupils were blown wide, and he clutched something to his chest. A child's drawing, the same stick family we'd found pinned inside a hut. He didn't say much that made sense. He kept pointing into the shaft as if the dark itself had been a person and asking it to come home. "Where were you?" I demanded, hoarse. Marco's voice was a dry thing. "I followed the whistle," he said. "I thought it was a joke. Then it showed me. They wanted me to help. They were so lonely. He broke into a laugh that had no joy in it. "I tried to bargain." Sierra grabbed him like she could keep him from falling apart. "What did you bargain with?" He pressed the drawing harder, as if it could be the world. "Promises," he said. "Names. I said I'd bring them the noise of trucks, the songs from the city. I said I'd bring them friends. I woke up at the shaft. I put the stone cairn. I buried the lamp. I tried to come back." I don't know how to tell you about the pause after that, the way the night seemed to inhale without exhaling. The whispering had swelled while we were in the shaft. When Marco came out, it turned into a keening, a long, tapered sound that braided with the wind and made the junipers shiver. We started back to the truck with Marco between us. He was walking, but his feet hit the ground like a man stepping on the edge of a dream. The tailgate bore fresh tallies now, another date gouged into the metal in a shaky hand, and beneath them, a child's scrawl, "Come home." It felt like a demand and a lullaby at once. At the truck, Logan fumbled for his keys, and the engine roared like a beast, relieved to be used. We drove without headlights for a while, the low moon hiding behind a bank of cloud, until the road found itself, and then we drove faster than travelers usually do. Juniper Hollow shrank in the rear view into a dark bruise on the land. The sheriff was patient and slow the next day, the kind of man used to missing hikers who'd taken a wrong turn. He took statements, he checked the area, he frowned over dates that matched old reports of disappearances, and he called in an officer from the county for old archival records. "We've had folks not come back from out there," he said, but his tone suggested the catalog of the weird was as boring to him as a tax ledger. He took Marco for evaluation, and eventually they found no physical explanation for how he'd been down there for hours and how he hadn't drowned or been eaten. The shaft had no obvious places for a person to hide for long, and yet he'd been there long enough to have those things in his hair and skin. We tried to tell the story in words that made sense. Marco's journal, the tally on the truck, the child's boot. Sierra carrying them to the sheriff like she could plant the evidence on a desk and expect a conclusion. The newspapers ran a small piece about hikers who'd found a man wandering out of the backcountry. The phrase spiritual disorientation appeared, as if the right medical term could tidy up a story that refused to be neat. They closed the case as a missing persons rescue and an isolated incident. The ledger in the miner's hut had names that matched missing persons reports going back to the 1930s. Names crossed, dates, odd notations about wind and children. But paper and ink make weak witnesses. The sheriff shrugged. He didn't sleep near Juniper Hollow. Who would? Weeks later, sleeping in my own bed in Phoenix, the sound of a distant siren made my stomach hollow out. I woke in the cold sweat of memory. Marco kept having dreams that he swallowed and couldn't get back. He'd call at 2 a.m. and tell me about the wind that asked his name. He tried to quit the jokes that had got him laughing around the campfire. Jokes seemed disrespectful now. He kept the child's drawing under his pillow for months like an offering. We never fully understood what happened in Juniper Hollow. Is it superstition? A long pattern of violence from someone like Old Kincaid, rumored to have done terrible, unnameable things in the past? Or is it a kind of grief the land keeps, a long, hungry memory that takes and asks and never stops asking for what it believes it lost? I can't prove a thing. I can only tell you the ledger's ink, the tally marks, Marco's half-mad confession that he'd bargained with voices in the dark. I can tell you the woman at the roadside market crossed herself and said, "Mind the night wind," and I can tell you the whistle, the thin, human-hearted call that sounds like a toy unspooling, still sits in the back of my mind sometimes when I'm quiet. The last time I went back out that way, years after, because some part of me still kept the defect of curiosity, I found the truck where we'd left it. Someone had spray painted over the tallies. The minor huts were more ruin than ruin, collapsing further into themselves. There were new names scratched onto the ledger pages if you looked long enough. The hollow kept its work. If you ever find yourself in a backcountry pull with junipers like sentries in minor huts that watch like old men, remember 3 things. Keep your group together, don't follow a sound that calls your name like a friend, and if a local gives you a warning, don't wave it off as charm. There are places in this world where the night keeps a tally, and sometimes those tallies include people who smiled around campfires, who thought a weekend could erase worry, who trusted that maps are only maps. Marco recovered enough to get back to work, but the gap in him remained. He quit the late-night beers and he sleeps with his back to the wall now. Sierra moved away from the valley. She says the desert took something from her, and she can't explain exactly what and doesn't have to. Logan and I don't go camping for the fun of it anymore. Juniper Hollow is a line in the map we don't cross. I tell you this not to spook you, though if it does, fine, but because some stories are warnings. There are whispers in the world that sound like invitations. Sometimes the thing calling you home lives in a hollow, and sometimes it lives in you. Be careful which you answer. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. This story is over. Get ready for the next one.